The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled The Annual Testimony of the Secretary of the Treasury on the State of the International Financial System. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I will note at the outset of this hearing that we have a hard stop as a courtesy to the Secretary at 1 p.m. this afternoon. We will strictly observe it. Now I recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Welcome, Secretary Yellen. I appreciate you being here today. Today's hearing is about the state of the international financial institutions, but I do want to take a minute and talk about the debt ceiling crisis that we narrowly avoided. First, we're all glad that this is behind us. No one wanted default, no legislative branch official, no executive branch official. Your statement says waiting until the last minute hurts American credibility. I agree. Madam Secretary, this could have been dealt with by the President, Speaker Pelosi, last year in the last Congress, or the President could have engaged sooner with Speaker McCarthy when they met on February 1st. But nonetheless, it is Mr. Biden signed into law an effective compromise. That said, there's a lot of frustration, particularly about the lack of transparency on when the Treasury Department expected the debt ceiling to be breached, otherwise known colloquially as the X date. At the end of February, the Chairman McHenry wrote you requesting information and your projections and calculations. Simple enough. The response was lacking, to put it mildly. This committee and Congress as a whole did not hear from you again until May 1st, after the House passed the Debt Ceiling Limit, Save, and Grow Act. 2 different X dates, June 1st and June 5th, were subsequently released. 0 explanation, 0 transparency. We all have to have confidence in the fiscal analysis of our government. Now I'd like to turn back and focus on the issue of the day, international financial institutions. Let's start where we agree. With the nomination of World Bank President Ajay Banga, Banga is a serious, competent leader who has the capacity to right the ship at the World Bank and continue the improvements and leadership from the former president, Mr. Malpass. The World Bank and the IMF should be laser focused on eliminating poverty and helping countries overcome crisis. But unfortunately, the international financial institutions seem to think about everything except economic growth. They've fallen into a bottomless word salad of empty rhetoric that serves Western NGOs, not the interest of developing countries. No wonder China has become the world's largest official creditor, even though its lending terms are often more burdensome than those of the international financial institutions. Africa is a helpful case study. Your recent response to our letter regarding energy was helpful, and we are grateful for that letter, but Treasury is opposing virtually all fossil fuel and nuclear projects in the multilateral development banks, even though half the continent of Africa doesn't have access to electricity. How does this make sense? Who is eager to build infrastructure there? China. Meanwhile, the IMF has completely failed to bring that country into compliance with international norms, that country being China. The fund must get serious about standing up to Chinese government if it takes its mission long-term seriously. If the fund keeps letting Beijing drag out restructuring talks with borrowers, there won't be much of a case for additional IMF resources at the end of this year. There's no doubt that China poses a generational threat to our national interest, but as long as we remain committed to our values, the U.S. will compete and outcompete the Chinese Communist Party. I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentlewoman from California, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'd like to welcome Secretary Yellen before our committee today. I want to first start out by noting that after the failures of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic Bank, it was the leadership and swift action taken by Secretary Yellen and our banking regulators that prevented a banking crisis, protected our economy, and ensured that depositors in the United States remain safe. That's not all. After months of Republican brinkmanship over our nation's debt, Secretary Yellen did a masterful job of blocking out lies coming from extreme MAGA Republicans by keeping Congress appropriately updated with the latest estimate of the X date and ensuring our bills were paid on time. It's this level of leadership that Secretary Yellen has also demonstrated on the world stage. Right now, climate change, global pandemics, and food scarcity pose major threats to the global economy. Now, after years of hostility and ignorance by officials appointed by the prior administration, Secretary Yellen is helping to restore the image of the United States all around the world and among our allies by pushing the World Bank, IMF, and other multilateral institutions to take serious action to tackle these existential threats before they get worse. Not only that, but under Secretary Yellen's leadership, the United States continues to impose severe sanctions against Russia, has increased financial resources for countries in need by authorizing additional IMF special drawing rights, and is promoting a strong and vibrant domestic economy by implementing transformational pieces of legislation like the American Rescue Plan and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Acts. Republicans, on the other hand, are failing to lead. They are actively denying that climate change exists, dismantling the government's ability to respond to pandemics, cutting off food aid to struggling countries, blocking their own legislation in the House, and threatening to drive our global economy off a cliff. It's telling that on the same day that we are hearing about the Secretary's and Treasury's efforts to bolster the global economy, Republicans will also bend over backwards to defend the twice impeached and indicted former President Trump, who is being arraigned for allegedly stealing and sharing some of the nation's closely guarded secrets and willfully undermining efforts to protect those secrets. The contrast between Democrats and Republicans is clear. After nearly tanking the economy, Republican infighting has ground the House floor to a halt. Make no mistake, their extreme MAGA agenda is not extreme enough for their extremists. Thankfully, under Democratic leadership, the United States is stronger than ever. We now have 28 consecutive months of strong growth, and during Biden's tenure, created a record 13 million jobs, all while cutting inflation by more than half compared to last summer based on the latest consumer price index. Numbers out of this morning will further progress expected in the months to come. The Biden administration and Democrats have shown that what happens when you deliver legislation that puts work and families first. I now look forward to today's testimony, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Luetkemeyer, the chairman of the Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Ms. Yellen. The international financial institutions were established to address economic challenges in distressed countries and cultivate economic growth around the world. However, it's becoming clear that these organizations are neither capable of nor interested in meeting these goals. The World Bank's unrealistic and harmful green agenda is preventing some of the poorest nations from obtaining the cheapest and most reliable energy sources, such as nuclear and natural gas. Ironically, the world's largest polluter, China, continues to receive sweetheart deals from the IFIs that no other wealthy nation is allowed to receive. The country with the world's second largest economy continues to receive more than $1 billion per year from the World Bank, and China remains one of the bank's largest debtors. Sadly, but not surprisingly, it's our money that is largely paying for these horrible policies. Secretary Yellen, I look forward to hearing your ideas to stop them. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions, Mrs. Beatty of Ohio, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking members, for holding this hearing. Madam Secretary, I'd like to thank you and the Biden-Harris administration for your leadership in preserving the strength and power of the United States on the global stage. It was under your leadership, your guidance, and most importantly, your advice that we avoided a bank crisis. We imposed economic measures in support of the Ukraine, averted a disastrous default, and promoted a strong and resilient domestic economy. Further, we have preserved our status in the global economy through your voice and vote at the IMF, World Bank, and other IFIs, a task that is increasingly critical as we see foreign adversaries seek to replace us in Africa and the Caribbean and around the world. Having traveled to the Caribbean with Congresswoman Waters, particularly Bahamas and Barbados, I have seen firsthand the destructive nature of Chinese relationships and recognized our significance. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for your leadership. I look forward to your testimony.
Gentlewoman yields back. Today, we welcome the testimony of the Honorable Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury. Secretary Yellen, we thank you for taking time to be here. You'll be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of our record. Secretary Yellen, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Waters. Thank you for your invitation to testify before this committee today in my capacity as chair of the National Advisory Council on International Monetary and Financial Policies. I'm looking forward to discussing Treasury's oversight of the international financial institutions. The past few years have demonstrated the importance of these institutions as part of our broader economic and foreign policy toolkit. Since 2020, global shocks such as the pandemic and Russia's legal war against Ukraine have had significant impacts on American families and businesses. In the face of these shocks, the international financial institutions advance U.S. national interests by fostering a more resilient global economy. They enable us to mobilize swift responses to mitigate global risk to the U.S. economic outlook, and they help drive U.S. economic growth by expanding global demand for American products and services. That's why there has always been a robust bipartisan consensus around strengthening America's leadership at these global institutions. Over the past year, these institutions have continued to make smart and cost-effective investments to meet urgent needs. They leverage our dollars to mobilize additional funding from our partners in the private sector. For example, the IMF approved a landmark $15 billion economic program for Ukraine earlier this year. This program, combined with direct budget support provided by the United States and our partners, will help Ukraine's immediate financing needs. It will also underpin its government's good governance and anti-corruption reform efforts. The World Bank and other multilateral development banks have also provided essential support to Ukraine that includes facilitating the responsible and accountable disbursement of funds to help stabilize its economy. Our leadership at these institutions is one of the core ways of engaging with emerging markets and developing countries. The IFIs provide real resources to tackle the challenges the world faces, from weathering economic storms to spurring long-term economic development. In 2022 alone, the development banks provided over $150 billion in funding to developing countries. These institutions reflect American values. Assistance from the IFIs come with strong requirements for governance, accountability, and debt sustainability. It serves as an important counterweight to non-transparent, unsustainable lending from others like China. As an example, the multilateral development banks are a leading source of financing to close the infrastructure gap in developing countries. These infrastructure projects adhere to robust technical and other standards that are aimed at achieving sustainable and inclusive growth in our partner communities. The United States is not a passive shareholder. We actively shape the priorities of these institutions as a leading shareholder in nearly all of them. A major project over the past few months has been to evolve the World Bank to better deliver against global challenges as part of its poverty reduction and development mission. We've already introduced reforms that will stretch the World Bank's balance sheet to unlock as much as $50 billion in additional lending capacity over the next decade. And we've made preliminary updates to its mission and operations. I'm looking forward to working with the new World Bank President, Ajay Banga, to build further momentum for our evolution initiative. Looking ahead, the Biden administration seeks to bolster U.S. leadership in these institutions. To that end, we request authorization to renew our participation in the IMF's new arrangements to borrow, a critical backstop to IMF resources. We also seek authorization to lend to two key IMF trust funds, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. These actions will help the IMF address economic crises with a particular emphasis on supporting developing countries amid heightened risks. We would also like to boost our involvement in IDB Invest and the African Development Fund. These investments will bolster our engagement in these regions at a time of geopolitical competition. I want to end by discussing the debt limit. I'm relieved that with the President's leadership, Congress took action to address the debt limit in time. But while we were able to avoid default, the United States once again came dangerously close to the line. This cannot be normalized as the way we do business in Washington. Waiting until the last minute hurts our global leadership and credibility on the world stage. We are a nation that keeps our word and pays our bills, and we should never give anyone any reason to think otherwise. Thank you.
We thank the Secretary for her testimony. I now turn to member questions. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Madam Secretary, I read with interest the G7 statement on Ukraine from your meeting in Hiroshima last month, which reiterated a commitment to stand against Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. G7 leaders called on Russia to pay for the damages and long-term reconstruction costs of Ukraine. And while the U.S. has made major contributions thus far, I agree that ultimately Russia should bear that responsibility. That's why I'm working on a bill called the Ukraine Reconstruction Act, which would ensure that the United States has the authority it needs to take title to Russian sovereign assets and transfer them to an international escrow fund to pay for war damages. This would be fully in line with international norms, conventions, and precedent, and also be done in coordination with our allies in Europe and elsewhere. It's also in line with both the G7 and the United Nations, which call for the establishment of, quote, an international mechanism for reparation for damage, loss, and injury, close quote, and pointed out Russia's frozen sovereign assets held in central banks around the world. I want to thank the Treasury for their technical assistance and particularly the engagement of your Deputy Secretary. Do you agree that this is the right approach and that legislation of this nature is necessary?
Well, let me start by thanking you for your engagement on this important issue. From the outset of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, we've taken decisive steps of immobilizing Russian central bank reserves, and working alongside our allies and partners, we have immobilized jointly about $300 billion worth of reserves. As you noted, we're committed with the G7 to ensuring that these assets remain immobilized until there's a resolution of the conflict in which Russia pays for the damage it's caused. And we're working with allies and partners also in the G7 and the so-called Repo Task Force on this issue. Now, however, it's the case that most of the assets, Russia's sovereign assets, are not in the United States. And for that reason, it's critical that any next steps we take be done via careful consultation with allies and partners in a coordinated approach. We are engaging in those discussions. We're working first to more accurately map exactly where these assets are, and we're examining a number of options, including some that we may be able to take under existing authorities, but we do look forward to working with you and members of Congress on this important issue.
I think that's important. I thank you for that. And I do think you're right. In each of the respective legal systems among the G7 nations and allied nations, they need companion-type legislation. Thank you for that. You chair the Financial Stability Oversight Council, the FSOC, and as chair, I assume it's fair to say that any report FSOC puts out, you put eyes on and have taken a look at. Is that true?
That's fair.
Last October, FSOC released a report called the Digital Asset Financial Stability Risks and Regulation Report, and it says, and I quote, "Digital asset businesses do not have a consistent or comprehensive regulatory framework and can take advantage of gaps in the regulatory system and engage in regulatory arbitrage." We couldn't agree more, many of us on both sides of the aisle, and I think FTX just showed just as long as these entities are outside the United States and outside some sort of a framework, Americans are continue to be at risk until we establish a regulatory framework protecting investors and innovators, but also that innovation, Web3 distributed ledger innovation in our country. So FSOC report recommended that Congress pass legislation to provide regulators authority over spot markets for digital assets, as well as legislation to give regulators more authority to have visibility into or supervise digital asset companies. We're working on that here in Congress. Are those recommendations from last fall or late summer's FSOC report still the recommendations of FSOC? That's still the view of FSOC?
Yes, that remains the view of FSOC, that there are some gaps like spot markets for crypto assets that are not securities. We would like to see a regulatory framework over those markets. And there are gaps in regulations. I would point out specifically stable coins. And I do believe that we need a comprehensive federal prudential framework and would be pleased to work with you, with Congress, to see if we can develop such a framework.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. My time's expired, and I'll now call on the gentlewoman, the ranking member of the full committee from California, Mrs. Waters, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Secretary Yellen. I would like at some point in time to really talk about Haiti and the lack of attention, I think, from anywhere dealing with that crisis there. But I know that it is important for them and civil society to get together to, plan a vote and get into government. And there's not a lot that our multilaterals can do, the World Bank or IMF, et cetera. But I'd like you to keep an eye on it so that as soon as we can get, government reestablished, et cetera, that the funding that's going to be necessary will have our support. So having said that, we'll talk about Haiti at another time. Okay. I'm working and will continue to work to see that civil society is involved in getting something done. Let me just turn to something that is a recent announcement, that is by the PGA, that the PGA Tour may be purchased by Live Golf, which is owned and controlled by Saudi officials, including the Saudi Crown Prince. As chair of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, you know that in assisting the president in overseeing the national security risk of foreign direct investments in the U.S. economy, the committee is permitted to consider, quote, whether any foreign person engaging in a covered transaction with a United States business has a history of complying with United States laws and regulations. Well, that's a quote. I believe that this consideration is a substantially lower bar than the serious crimes committed by the Saudi Arabian government and its officials. Saudi Arabia has a repressive government known for chilling jailing dissidents, and enacting draconian punishments. The Crown Prince himself has been implicated by our own intelligence community in the brutal kidnapping, torture, murder, and dismemberment of an American resident. Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, further, as shared by 9/11 Families United, the families of the victims of the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, in response to the news of the merger. The kingdom spent their billions of dollars before 9/11 to fund terrorism, spread their vitriolic hatred of Americans, and finance Al-Qaeda and the murder of our loved ones. These same 9/11 families are still waiting for justice in their lawsuit against the Saudis as the Saudi government obstructs court processes and obscures the truth, dragging out the families' suffering and restitution for over 2 decades. Can you share what scrutiny this particular deal between Live Golf and PGA Tour may receive? Is CFIUS looking into their investments by the Saudi sovereign wealth fund in general, given its historic and continued failure to comply with U.S. law and regulation?
So what I can say is that CFIUS is a very important part of Treasury's national security mission, and the committee is very well positioned to review transactions that do involve national security concerns. Regrettably, because there are very strict rules of confidentiality, I'm not in a position to be able to comment on any specific matter or potential case, but certainly where there are national security concerns, CFIUS is in a position and does review transactions.
Thank you for that clarification. In essence, what I've heard is you cannot comment on what is going on now, but there's a possibility because they have the responsibility to review these kinds of transactions.
That's correct.
To determine whether or not it's in our best interest or our security is somehow compromised because of the transaction. And I thank you for that, because I do believe that and hope that CFIUS will take it up. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States has some of the best capital markets in the world and are critical to the strength of our economy. During the challenging last several years, our capital markets were essential in facilitating capital and managing risk for U.S. businesses, investors, and even the government. While we don't yet have the details of Basel III proposal coming from the Fed, Vice Chair Barr has indicated it will impact the capital market activities of large U.S. institutions. I'm concerned about adding punitive capital charges to U.S. banks is counterproductive to promoting liquidity and efficient markets. This will come at the same time the SEC is engaged in dramatic and transformational market structure changes at an unprecedented rate. Since Treasury's mission is to maintain a strong economy and promote economic growth and stability, are you confident that these policy changes will not undermine the resilience of the U.S. capital markets that support the economy, Madam Secretary?
I certainly agree with the goal that you mentioned of maintaining strong capital markets. I'm not really in a position to comment on these regulations. I don't believe they've been released yet, and I haven't been fully briefed, but we will certainly review carefully, think about the implications that forthcoming changes could have for the functioning of our capital markets, and particularly for the Treasury market, where we have a particular responsibility.
Just to reiterate, it is concerning that U.S. banks will have to implement both significant market structure changes, including and affecting the U.S. Treasury markets, and increased capital requirements associated with market activities. I'll ask this: are the Fed and the SEC coordinating with Treasury on the economic analysis necessary to understand potential consequences to both markets and end users,
And will you commit to this analysis?
Well, I believe this is likely to be a Fed set of regulations and proposals. The Treasury is not involved in reviewing those, but I'm assuming that the Federal Reserve would, possibly jointly with the FDIC, put out a notice of proposed rulemaking, and that we would certainly have the opportunity to discuss.
You see where my
review,
concern
comment.
is. The potential impact is so dramatic. If the entities that are engaged in these various elements of dramatic change aren't cross-referencing their actions, the possibility of unintended consequences, that just concerns me. Question number 2. In the European Union, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive went into effect in January of this year. The CSRD will require companies to disclose a host of far-reaching ESG information. These requirements will also apply to non-EU companies that have a significant EU presence, which could have a substantial impact on industries here at home. For example, the agriculture sector, companies that do business in Europe are navigating through how to comply with the disclosures required to climate change. Scope 3 emissions, water usage, biodiversity, ecosystem data. Secretary Yellen, does the Treasury have an estimate of how many U.S. companies will be impacted by the CSRD and the difficulty these companies could face?
Well, I don't have such an estimate, but let me say that while we're supportive of the high-level aims of the CSDDD, we are concerned that it has extraterritorial scope and potential for unintended negative consequences for U.S. firms. This is something that we are discussing with the European Union and will certainly make our concerns known.
I just have to note for the record that it is important that we do not allow Europe to become the standard setters for the United States. U.S. regulators should be diligent in protecting U.S. interest and in defending U.S. sovereignty. That's your job and mine, Secretary.
Agree. I think that some of the requirements could affect the global activities of U.S. firms where there is no clear nexus to the EU, and that certainly concerns us.
Because Brussels seems to be playing for keeps on everything that involves economics. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Velasquez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Secretary Yellen, in July 2021, the IMF Board of Directors found that climate change is an existential threat that poses critical macroeconomic and financial policy challenges that will confront all its members in the decades to come. How is the Treasury Department working to integrate the macroeconomic effects of climate change into the IMF's core activities?
Well, we are concerned about integrating it into both the IMF's work, but also, perhaps more important, the work of the multilateral development banks. The multilateral development banks, we think, need to evolve the work that they do to move from focusing purely on country-specific challenges that affect poverty to responding better to global challenges, including climate change and pandemics, as well as fragility and conflict. And we have spearheaded a process to evolve the work, mission, operating modes, and strategies of the World Bank, starting with the World Bank, to be able to better address these challenges. This is something that the new president of the World Bank will be deeply involved in. And, you know, at the IMF, addressing climate change is not the core mission, but they are certainly involved in evaluating climate change as it impacts a country and its possible macroeconomic stability.
Thank you. And Secretary Yellen, I have been concerned about the rapid speed at which Silicon Valley Bank grew in size and complexity, and I'm considering legislation on the issue. The Fed's review of the bank's failure notes a similar concern. As chair of the FSOC, did this concern you as well?
Well, it certainly did concern me, the set of banking problems that were touched off by the failure of this bank. And the Fed produced quite quickly a report on its supervision of Silicon Valley Bank that did point to deficiencies. After all, this was a very rapidly growing bank, and it had a unique structure that potentially made it vulnerable to runs. So that is a matter that it is appropriate to address by the banking supervisors.
Thank you. As chair of the FSOC, do you believe regulators have all the tools necessary to ensure that as a bank grows in size and complexity, particularly over a short period of time, heightened regulatory and supervisory standards are able to be quickly applied?
I believe that the regulators, the bank regulators, do have the authority to put in place effective regulations and supervision to address these issues. Some of the supervisory standards were relaxed, and we think it's appropriate. The president thinks it's appropriate, and I think the Federal Reserve thinks it's appropriate to revisit some of the changes and also to shore up bank supervision.
I too believe it's appropriate. Thank you for that answer. CDFIs are critical to our LMI and underserved communities. Recently, I have heard concerns from CDFIs about a new certification proposal from the CDFI fund that could make it difficult for CDFIs to lend in the communities they serve and would undermine the ability of CDFIs to effectively inject funds into communities that desperately need support. Are you aware of the proposals from the CDFI fund?
I'm aware that there's a plan to update the CDFI certification process. That's something that hasn't been reviewed for about 25 years, and the potential importance of the CDFI designation.
Madam Secretary,
grown.
the gentlelady's time has expired. You can answer the rest for the record. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is now recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Madam Secretary, thank you for being with us today. Your presence here allows us to not only engage with you on your thinking, but also helps us articulate policy that we believe. Madam Secretary, almost effective with the President taking office, President Biden taking office, the Fed began loaning the United States government about $120 billion a month. And then tapering about a year later took place where that was reduced to about $105 billion. Could you please tell me the current amount of money that the that the Fed is putting in to the United States economy that we take loans out for?
So this is really a question for Chair Powell rather than myself, but
that's a question of anybody that's on top of financial interests of the United States, because today we're talking about the state of international finance systems, and if the entire world sees where America cannot even stand on its own 2 feet without taking a loan out that we pay interest on, and the Secretary of Treasury won't even answer the question.
Well, I'm sorry, I'll answer the question.
Thank you.
The Fed is engaging in what's sometimes called quantitative tightening, which is a reversal of its long-term Treasury and mortgage-backed security purchases it's now reducing its holdings by redeeming principal as it comes due and reducing its holdings over time of these assets. And it's something that they deemed appropriate as part of a monetary policy that's aimed at having a more normal size of Fed portfolio and is part of their strategy to address inflation.
Well, I just heard you address one side of the equation. If you'd please answer my question, how much money does the Fed put into our economy that we take out a loan for, not how we change out those loans and change them based upon the interest rate? How much money every month does the Fed put into our economy to prop it up?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I know what you mean by money the Fed puts into the economy.
So the Fed does not loan the federal government any money new money that we take interest out on. Is that your testimony?
The Fed provides reserves to the banking system and in doing so purchases Treasury assets and mortgage-backed securities guaranteed by Fannie and Freddie, and it does that to serve a monetary policy purpose.
Madam Secretary, I believe, and you're entitled to your own opinion, this administration is, that when the United States of America takes out loans that we receive from the Fed that we pay interest on, it is a message to the world that we cannot stand on our own 2 feet with our own vibrant economy. And it sends a huge message that either we cannot manage our own spending habits or that we are allowing our own people to stay at home and not to produce and grow our economy. This economy that we have, I think that we have seen, produced a doubling in the amount of money that came in to the Treasury from 2010 of about 2.1 trillion to about 2021 or 22 of about $4.9 trillion. We doubled the amount of money that comes into the Treasury. Your testimony today is that you were suggesting that we are not taking out any loans from the Fed that we would pay interest for, and I appreciate your time before this committee today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is now recognized.
Madam Secretary, we deal with investor protection in this committee. The SEC is looking at swing pricing rules dealing with mutual funds that will undermine investor protection. And the word is out that it is the FSOC, yourself and the Fed, that somehow believe and are pushing the SEC to have these regulations to prevent a precipitous sell-off in U.S. securities should there be a crisis. I just want to ask, I'm not going to ask you a question at this point, but I'd hope you'd re-examine your position there, because telling the American people there's a crisis, we don't want you to sell your stocks, we're going to impose a penalty on you for selling your mutual funds, is one way to get them running toward the exit. So it's bad investor protection, it's bad systemic regulation. I do hope that you'll leave it to the SEC what they do on swing pricing. Your testimony talked about the IMF. Pakistan is engaged in negotiations right now. This is a unique opportunity to help the people of Pakistan, but also a unique opportunity to focus on human rights, democracy, and timely elections in Pakistan. And I hope that the U.S. voice is being used there to push Pakistan toward democracy and human rights. Iran has special drawing rights at the IMF, and I wonder how we as a Congress can reauthorize IMF and leave that untouched. IMF may ultimately have to decide, do they want American participation or do they want Iran to have special drawing rights? In March of 2023, this year, Secretary Blinken identified that the Amhara regional forces in northern Ethiopia were engaged in ethnic cleansing and war crimes. The Human Rights Watch has identified 2 particular individuals that are responsible for those war crimes, and I hope that the Treasury would look at sanctioning those 2 individuals. Believe it or not, I have a question. We have a capital gains allowance that costs us tens of billions of dollars that is justified as encouraging people to make investment that helps an economy grow. And maybe that makes sense unless the economy you're growing is China. Can you think of a reason why we use the tax system to subsidize U.S. investment in Chinese companies?
I'm sorry, in what way do we?
Well, if you buy if you work hard and earn money, you pay the full ordinary income tax rate. But if instead you invest in Huawei and the price goes up and you make the same amount of money, you pay a much lower rate. And if you die while holding that, you get a step up in basis and you pay no tax at all. So the full panoply of investment incentives built into our tax code is there for China. Is there a reason why we're incentivizing investments in Chinese stocks?
Well, we have policies about how we tax capital gains on assets and
Can you think of why we provide these subsidies, apply these to Chinese stocks, except that we got lazy and we wrote them up for all stocks and we forgot China?
This is the policy that we have for all assets,
I look forward to
Chinese
working
assets.
with you to come up with a policy that makes some foreign policy sense. Finally, the chair talked about crypto and said we need a regulatory scheme. I want to say we have a regulatory scheme. We have the securities laws. Thank God Gensler is enforcing them. But we also have recently adopted tax laws dealing with crypto. The Inflation Reduction Act said you've got to report on Form 1099. In December of last year, Treasury announced that crypto brokers, however, wouldn't have to report until final regulations were issued. These final regulations have been approved by the OMB, but remain unissued. Mr. Lynch and I sent you a letter just recently urging you. The SEC has proved they're not afraid of the crypto bros. I know you're not afraid of the crypto bros. I hope the IRS is not afraid of them. When are we going to see these regulations so that if you make a profit on selling your crypto, you at least have to pay taxes on it?
We will get back to you on that shortly.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, given the trajectory of the Russian oil revenues, has the administration sanction on oil from Russia been a failure?
We have taken important actions. Of course, the United States is sanctioned. We're not allowed to purchase Russian oil. And by and large, the G7 is not purchasing Russian oil. And we have taken very important steps to reduce the revenue that Russia is able to earn from its oil production and sales by placing a price cap on sales of Russian oil that make use of any G7 service, including insurance or shipping. And the Russia's revenue, but we also want to make sure that the oil market remains, the global oil market remains well supplied so that oil prices don't spike as a consequence of Russia's inability to sell any of their oil. Russia's revenues
why are the Russians' revenue going up?
Russia's revenue is roughly halved over the last year. Russian authorities have indicated that the price cap that we've placed on Russian oil has had a very serious negative impact on them, reducing their revenues. Their budget has gone from large surplus to deficit, and they've had to change the way in which they tax their oil companies to derive revenue from oil sales, something that's harming their long-run ability to invest in the oil industry. I think our policy there has been quite successful.
All right. Why hasn't the administration acted aggressively to impose sanctions on China for the apparent human rights violations, such as those experienced by the Uyghurs?
We have put in place sanctions for human rights violations and continue to examine further sanctions that we can levy.
Well, the president vetoed my Congressional Review Act resolution aimed at stopping the Commerce Department's solar panel rule that allows China's solar panels to evade our tariffs by permitting them through third world nations. Why do you support giving the Chinese the exemption?
So what we do at Treasury is we focus on sanctions on Xinjiang for human rights abuses, and I'm not familiar with the Commerce Department's thinking on this issue.
Well, so you weren't consulted on it at all? I mean, you have no clue about what's going on?
I haven't been involved in that aspect of policy toward China.
But, you said you aim to do something about human rights violations, and you just seem totally unconcerned about this.
I am concerned about human rights violations. I think that's a core principle of U.S. policy toward China, is that we will not do business with China in cases where there are human rights violations, and have put in place meaningful sanctions.
Yeah, do you have any idea why he vetoed the legislation that would put the slave labor at a disadvantage instead of an advantage over American products?
Sorry, I'm not familiar with the legislation in detail.
Okay. What is the Biden administration's strategy to use our participation in international financial institutions to address and mitigate the threats posed by China to our financial and economic well-being and to the geopolitical stability?
So we have taken the position that the multilateral development banks, particularly the World Bank, should graduate China and cease lending to China. And we are working very hard to try to get China to meet its responsibilities when it comes to debt restructuring and debt relief. And we've had some success in those efforts. China's played a constructive role in Ghana and Sri Lanka, but there are other
The gentleman's time has
countries
expired.
like Zambia.
The gentleman's
where
time
we've
has
got
expired, and the secretary can answer the rest on the record. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, is now recognized.
Thank you. And Madam Secretary, I want to thank you for your tireless effort to ensure that the United States financial system remains as strong, from your role in helping us to avoid a catastrophic default, to containing spillover from the recent bank failures, to ensuring that the United States remains a global leader through our international policies and partnerships. And I know very much so we are fortunate to have you at the helm. Let me ask you, I'm not in favor of sanctioning everything and everybody, but I do believe we need to be judicious in picking sanction targets. But there are a couple of energy companies in different parts of the world that are crucial sources of funds of despotic regimes. And I keenly focused on Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear company. Not only is it a major source of funds for the Putin regime and one of the only largely unsanctioned Russian energy companies, but they've also been playing a major role in courting a nuclear disaster at Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine. And I really believe that this company needs to be fully sanctioned to keep funds from Putin's army and to support our friends in Ukraine, and I've drafted legislation to that end. So I'd appreciate your thoughts on Rosatom, and further, I would invite you to speak about your leadership in coordinating and leading the international support effort of Ukraine and the importance of our continued support.
Well, I believe strongly, and President Biden has said, and I've said, that we stand with Ukraine and will do so for as long as it takes. And we're using our sanctions authority and our export controls and other authorities that we have to do all we can to support Ukraine in its fight against what's been a brutal invasion. I'm afraid that I can't comment specifically on Rosatom, but I would say that we have taken steps to designate a number of subsidiaries of that firm to degrade the firm's activities in some key areas. And we've designated officials from the company as recently as February. And let me just say that we continue to take further sanctions actions as we can justify, and in situations where we think we're able to mitigate unanticipated or unwanted consequences. And while I can't preview specific sanctions actions that we're going to take, we continue to take sanctions actions to degrade Russia's defense and industrial sectors.
Thank you. Let me jump to another question that I'd like to address, and that's debt relief for the developing world. On the one hand, many countries owe funds to the World Bank and other international financial institutions, but on the other, they often owe even more in opaque loans to China. I simultaneously believe it is crucial that the United States, one, provide necessary debt relief to stave off hunger and abject poverty to countries in Africa and South Asia, but two, to make sure that debt relief from global institutions is not used to pay off debts to China. Can you talk about the administration's approach to this dilemma?
Well, we're very concerned about the large and growing number of countries that require debt relief in order to restart economic growth. And these countries come to the IMF in order to obtain help, put in place structural reforms, and gain funding. And to qualify for those programs, they have to have a sustainable debt trajectory. And we've devised the so-called common framework to help firms manage their debt situations and to restructure debt. And we're disturbed that relatively few countries have signed up for common framework debt treatments, and among those that have, some have waited years and not been successful in being able to bring all the creditors to the table to restructure debt. And Zambia is a country that I'm particularly concerned about and recently revisited. It has a government that really wishes to restart growth and to be able to borrow, to invest, to promote economic growth, and it can't do so without that. And China is not coming to the table. We're working very hard to change.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ms. Yellen, for being, Secretary Yellen, for being here today. Statutorily, you're required to be here before the Financial Service Committee to talk about international financial system. We appreciate your willingness to do that. I wish you would be the same attentive to what you're supposed to be doing with the Small Business Committee as well. You're well over 2 years since you're supposed to statutorily have been there, and subsequent visits have not been taking place either. So I hope you would attend to your statutory duties in that committee as well. One of the things that I'm concerned about, and we've talked about a little bit here in the last few of my colleagues this morning, was sanctions and how it all structured with China and that sort of stuff. And I asked this question maybe the last time you were here with regards to the possible invasion of Taiwan. We learned from Russia when it invaded Ukraine that we didn't really have a plan put together on how to put a group of sanctions together on different entities, whether it be oligarchs, the country itself, and we had to sort of, after the fact, get up to speed and get it done. I asked the question last time you were here, if you're putting together a plan with regard to China and its possible invasion of Taiwan. At that time, I got no response indicating to me that there is no plan. So since then, has the Treasury worked with Commerce, anybody else, to begin to put together a plan should China invade Taiwan?
So the National Security Council works with the interagency to make sure that it is in a position to address threats to our national security. And
so-
I'm not in a position to be able to provide any details at all about what the response would be to hypothetical events pertaining to Taiwan. But
Okay.
I will say that this is something we work with other agencies to make sure that the United States is
Okay, I
prepared
understand you
to
can't
deal.
tell me anything more than just a yes. That's what I want to hear. Thank you. You've addressed a little bit about this next question with regards to China having access to the World Bank. It's kind of interesting, second largest economy in the world, and yet in order to be able to qualify for the loans, you got to be a low and moderate income country. I would assume you would agree that they are not a low and moderate income country?
Certainly, I don't think that they should qualify for World Bank loans.
I had a discussion today with the president of the World Bank, and I discussed this issue with him, how and why China continues to have access to this and why we can't stop this from happening. You indicated in your earlier discussion with some of our members here that you're working to try and stop that. Can you tell me exactly what you're doing to stop that?
Well, we will not support or vote in favor of any World Bank lending to China, so we use our voting to oppose it. And we have certainly worked to convince other countries in the World Bank to cease funding. And, while there is some, it is a very small part now of the World Bank's activities. We
Okay, so
believe it should
basically,
cease.
my understanding is we participate about 17% of the total, and China is roughly 2%, something like that.
I believe it's much lower than that, but I can get you a number.
Okay,
I think
but
it's
significantly different in amounts of participation, yet they have been access to it. And because of our overwhelming participation, the amount that we have in there, we have an outsized voice on that in that board. Is that correct?
we do. We have
Okay.
we have
That's fine.
significant.
So we need to be exerting our authority to be able to, our opposition on the board to put China back in its place. And that's what you're going to try and do, correct?
Yes.
Okay. A minute ago, you said that you're seeking authorization to participate in some other international financial institutions. You need to have them to be reauthorized every year. Is that correct? You said
I
something-
guess what I said is we would like permission to continue participating in the new arrangements to borrow, and we also seek permission to lend up to $21 billion to two IMF funds, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and the Resilience.
Madam Secretary, if we're going to be loaning money to these foreign financial institutions, and the kind of money you're talking about, do you not believe that we need to have more control over them to make sure that entities such as China don't have access to them?
Well, we have substantial control over them. We have made sure that the structure of
This
these
is where we're gonna
funds,
go. If you want
they cannot lend to China. The Poverty Reduction and Growth
The gentleman's
Trust
time has
is only
expired.
for very low-income
The secretary
countries.
can answer for the record. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, is recognized.
Thank you very much. Chair Yellen, I'm very worried about China. And I want to ask you something. Should we consider prohibitions for U.S. private equity investment in private sector firms which have ties to the Chinese military and the Chinese state surveillance apparatus? Now, you are very much aware of the reports that China is trying to establish a military base operations just 90 miles from our shores in Cuba. What is your assessment of this? Are you taking this as serious as I am? And what do you propose we should do for any private equity firm that would have connections with their military or surveillance operation? This is very serious. You know, I mentioned this in an earlier session we had when we failed to shoot down that surveillance balloon. And I said then that this was a mistake by the Biden administration. It was a mistake because it showed weakness to China, and it showed uncertainty to our own friends. So tell me, what do we do about this situation? What is your assessment about this threat? And should we not prohibit any investments to any of these Chinese companies that have connections and are involved with China's military and surveillance apparatus?
So we are looking at potential restrictions on outbound investment that could pertain to private equity firms that invest in Chinese firms with connections to their military. And we are worried about potential national security risks that would come.
Let me ask you this in my time. What is your assessment of it? I have great respect for you. You've been our leading Treasury Secretary on 2 terms, and I've worked with you, and I respect your broad intelligence on foreign matters. How serious are you taking this effort to put a military surveillance 90 miles from our shores?
Well, we are concerned about China's role in the Caribbean and in Latin America more generally.
But as Secretary, I want what you feel. Do you feel like I feel that this is a serious attack on the United States? Now, if you remember, about 50 years ago, they tried to do something similar. But John Fitzgerald Kennedy acted promptly. What are we going to do?
Well, I don't have an answer for you on what we're going to do, but certainly protecting our national security is a core concern. And with respect to China, we're carrying that out in a broad range of ways, from export controls to entity lists to, in some cases, sanctions and potentially restrictions on outbound investment.
Do you feel that this may be a primary move that would precede their intentions over in Kuwait and in Taiwan?
I really can't comment on that. I don't.
All right. Thank you, Secretary.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Secretary Yellen, good to see you again. I'm going to touch on a couple of things real quickly. I wanted to make sure I heard correctly, though. I think you had answered to an earlier question. The PGA and LIV agreement is something that Treasury is planning to look at? I know you're not going to get into specifics of it, but is it something that is going to be subject to CFIUS review?
Well, again, I'm not allowed to talk about any specific matter before CFIUS. There are very strict rules about that, but
But would it, okay, let me clarify. Does it seem to fit the general parameters of what CFIUS typically is reviewed?
if there are national security risks, then the answer is yes. CFIUS looks at
And the
national
definition of national security
risks.
risk is well vetted and well understood?
I believe it is, yes.
Okay, all right, I'll leave it at that for right now. I did want to touch quickly as well on the debt ceiling, something you had brought up in the close of your opening. It was June 1st deadline that you initially gave Congress and everybody else to reach the borrowing authority, that when you were going to reach it. That then moved to the 5th. Others who have been involved in Treasury speculated that it could have been well beyond June 5th. I'm curious, was there actual analysis done by the Treasury to determine this date, and what changed? Or was this artificially manufactured? I mean, in all fairness, you took Congress to task about not taking this to the brink. And in all fairness, the White House, and specifically the president, ignored Kevin McCarthy, the speaker, for nearly 100 days after he said he was going to have negotiations with him. So it would just seem to me that if the White House recognizes that that's not a good brinksmanship, trying to apply that to Congress, why didn't the president take your advice?
I'm sorry, there's nothing political whatsoever about the information and advice that I have given to Congress about when our resources would be exhausted.
So do you have any insight as to why the president didn't negotiate for 100 days?
In early January, I indicated that we felt confident our resources could last until the beginning of June.
Okay. All right, I'm going to move on. I did
cited-
reclaiming my time. I did read the statements. You had said June 1st or the following weeks, at which then tightened up, and that's fine. That's not what we're here today about.
It was consistent with outside
Reclaiming my
forecasts.
time on this, because I do want to hit on the International Development Finance Corporation as well, but I am also going to say repeat something to you that I've repeated to every other person from this administration, and frankly, the last administration. Congressional oversight is vital to the work that we do. I happen to chair the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee this particular Congress, and it is necessary to reiterate our constitutional requirement and standing and obligation that we ask for and receive information that is going to help us do that job. We have sent, this committee and my subcommittee specifically, has sent you 4 requests to provide specific documents and information with respect to the March 2023 bank failures, as well as Treasury's role in the digital asset space. I know the ranking member brought up the bank failures, so it seems to me fair game. The first set of requests are important to help this committee understand both Treasury and FSOC's role in the bailout of both Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, and specifically the use of systemic risk exception. To date, we have received what I would generously call limited information from your staff. For example, in response to our March request, we received a copy of the FSOC meeting minutes from March only after they were publicly published on Treasury's website. Frankly, we don't need your help. We've got that. And frankly, it's a waste of your time and whoever's reviewing this and your staff's time, and it therefore, Madam Secretary, wastes our time. So let's get beyond the games of sending back and forth publicly available information and actually get to our constitutional oversight role. Will you provide and commit to me, provide the underlying records of the published meeting minutes, including draft minutes and notes from the March 12 and March 24 FSOC meetings regarding the bank failures? This is what we had been asking.
We've provided, there are now minutes in the public domain.
Yeah, the minutes that are in the public, and you didn't send them until after they were available in the public. I want to know the draft
they need to
minutes,
be approved by the committee.
the draft minutes and the notes.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Madam Secretary, And may I say thank you for your wonderful leadership and your service to our country.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. I want to revisit the aftermath of the Silicon Valley Bank collapse and the exercise of the exception that we allowed to be exercised instead of operating or allowing the least cost resolution practice to go into effect. I know there are 5 requirements statutorily that must be considered by you and the FDIC and SEC. And there's a consultation requirement with the president. But
That's right.
in the aftermath of all of that, some of this is Monday morning quarterbacking, but there are some that say that perhaps exercising that exception, the risk exception, that we may have been able to resolve this situation without exercising or reverting to that exception. In your own mind, and look, this collapse happened in a matter of 2 days.
Yes.
I asked the same question to Chair Grunberg of the FDIC when he was before the committee. Can you think of any alternative in retrospect that might have existed other than using the financial risk exception?
Well, all of us involved in making those decisions were tremendously concerned that the failure of these 2 banks in a matter of 2 days created a huge risk of contagion to banks throughout the country. There are a large fraction of uninsured deposits at many banks, and we were concerned that depositors would be terrified by these rapid and unanticipated failures, and that we would see contagion and runs on many banks. And we felt that we needed to ensure depositors broadly that their deposits were safe. And this was a way of doing it, and I believe it succeeded. While there was First Republic, later failed, we have not seen, I believe, these actions, plus the creation of a new liquidity facility by the Federal Reserve. I believe it stopped contagion and stabilized our banking system, and it was a very dangerous moment.
Yeah, the problem that I see is that the least cost resolution preference was meant to lower the costs of resolution.
That's right.
And it's hard for me to imagine a similar situation ever arising where, a systemic risk exception would not apply. And I'm just wondering if this exception has swallowed the rule. Rather than going with a low-cost resolution, we're going to fall into this same scenario over and over again.
I don't think it would fall into the same situation over and over again. Hundreds of banks failed in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. The FDIC resolved most of them, and they used the least cost method of resolution. So this is a very unusual situation where this exception had to be invoked.
Let me ask you.
First Republic was resolved,
Okay.
and it was also done in a least cost resolution.
Okay. Well, my concerns still remain. Let me ask you another question about JP Morgan Chase and their assumption later on in a different process. Isn't it always the case that the biggest banks will seem to be the sturdiest and the best able to absorb another bank that is failing or in receivership?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature were assumed merged into smaller banks, not nearly that size. But when the FDIC resolves a bank, it is required by law to take the best offer.
The gentleman's time has
It's
expired.
In this
Thank-
case, it was J.P. Morgan
The
Chase.
gentlewoman
Thank
from
you, Madam
Missouri.
Secretary. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is now recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, over here. Last month, the G7 leaders, of which the United States is one, agreed in a joint statement on an economic approach to China that would focus on, and I quote, de-risking, and rebukes calls for decoupling from China's economy. However, I have to say I think it's appropriate and, in fact, essential that we decouple from Chinese industries and entities that are actively participating in unthinkable human rights abuses, including the CCP's genocide of Uyghur Muslims. So please tell me, how does Treasury plan to de-risk the U.S. economy from this appalling tragedy?
Well, in the case of human rights violations and Xinjiang, there is no business. We have sanctions in place that prevent Americans from doing business with entities that are involved in human rights.
And that's how you're de-risking. You say you have sanctions. I'd like to see those sanctions and what companies have been sanctioned for doing business with China as they exploit the human rights of the Uyghur Muslims. If you could provide that, please.
Well, we've sanctioned Chinese individuals and entities for human rights abuses there, and
I'd like to get a list of those,
businesses.
if I could, please. And I do need to move on with respect. According to a recent Bloomberg report, Chinese purchases of Iranian crude had jumped in March by 20% month on month, totaling 800,000 barrels imported a day. In March, Iran said it is now exporting more oil today than at any time since the 2018 reimposition of sanctions. Current law requires Treasury to target foreign financial institutions that are involved in these sales. Ma'am, how many foreign financial institutions have you sanctioned as a result of these sales?
Well, we certainly are doing everything in our power.
That's not my question. How many foreign financial institutions have you sanctioned as a result of these sales and this huge 20% increase by Iran?
So
Don't know the answer. If you could, would you please provide me the answer? Because this is unconscionable, and I do not believe the Treasury is following the law, and it is a law that requires Treasury to, in fact...
We have an exceptionally tight sanctions regime in place with respect
I don't know what your plan is to further
Iran.
tighten enforcement of these sanctions regimes against Iran as the country continues to make alarming progress on nuclear armament, but I am very interested in finding out. Next, Secretary Yellen, it has long been U.S. policy to support Taiwan's membership in international organizations where statehood is not a prerequisite. The International Monetary Fund has no conditions regarding statehood. The Financial Services Committee unanimously passed legislation supporting Taiwan's membership at the fund earlier this year. Taiwan already belongs to the WTO and the Asian Development Bank. If it sought, it being Taiwan, membership at the IMF, would Treasury support it?
We would have to look at that. It's not a member of the IMF.
If they
and
sought it,
would
after
have
this,
to.
unanimously, we have done that. We have passed that as a committee. Yes, I would like your response on that specific. This is 3 in a row now that I've asked for specifics that you don't have answers to, ma'am, and it's unacceptable. Let me ask another. Following up on some of my questions from my friends on the other side of the aisle, I want to ask you about the SEC's sweeping proposal on mandatory swing pricing, hard close, and liquidity risk management. Chair Gensler has said the proposal is needed to combat dilution, but I've seen no evidence from the SEC that dilution is a significant problem for mutual funds. In fact, I've seen some commenters offer their own economic analysis showing that dilution is minimal and far surpassed by returns for long-term investors. If implemented, the proposal would add significant costs and damages. Why is this? I guess I'd like to get your perspective on this misguided SEC proposal.
Well, it's a question you should be asking to Chair Gensler.
I know, but I'm
not
asking you,
to
but you
me.
can't answer this question
What if?
either.
I'm sorry. I'm going to answer the question.
Well, I'm out of time.
What if?
So you'll have to answer this question in writing too. 4 questions that you'll have to answer in
Sorry, the gentlelady's time has expired, but the secretary can answer in writing for the record. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is now recognized.
Madam Secretary, you won't have to answer in writing. I yield time to you to answer. You may answer now.
On the last question.
Yes,
question.
Yes, answer now, please.
Yes. Well, the Financial Stability Oversight Council has discussed risks in connection with open-end mutual funds, particularly bond mutual funds, where there can essentially be runs in situations where those who move first in these open-end funds are able to get better pricing than those who wait until later. And this creates a financial stability risk similar to the kind of risk that exists with money market mutual funds that has long been a subject of FSOC attention. And the FSOC has not been involved in advising the SEC how to address those risks, but swing pricing is a way to reduce or eliminate first mover advantage and to diminish the odds of runs that can lead to fire sales of assets that can have contagious effects throughout the financial system. And we saw this occur when the pandemic struck in March of 2020, and it was a reason that the Federal Reserve created a facility to try to stem those runs.
I thank my friend.
Thank you,
Mr.
Madam.
Green. I thank my friend very, very, very much, and she's used far too much of your time.
I'm going to have to continue with my time
Yes,
now. Please
thank you very
forgive me.
much.
Unless the chair is willing to accord me additional time.
The gentleman has 3 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for your service to the country, and I also thank the President. I believe the President, working with you, you've done an outstanding job. I'm not ashamed to say it. I'm not ashamed to associate myself with you or with the President. Madam Secretary, in your testimony, the written testimony, you indicate that while we were able to avoid default, the United States once again came dangerously close to the line. You indicate further that this cannot be normalized. You're saying here that waiting until the last minute hurts our global leadership and credibility on the world stage. Could you, in about 1 minute, give me some more information on how we are harmed on the world stage by waiting until the last minute to deal with default credit?
Yes, I mean, the United States has the world's deepest and most liquid capital markets, and U.S. Treasury securities are the benchmark for pricing of virtually all securities that are traded in financial markets. And the dollar is, of course, the world's key reserve currency. And all of that rests on an assumption, a belief that the United States is committed to paying its bills when they come due, that we are a creditor that deserves a AAA rating. We lost that rating in 2011 when Congress went right up to the wire in failing to raise the debt ceiling. And even in this situation, one rating agency has put us on negative credit watch. And this is something that threatens our position as a global leader in financial markets, and it threatens the well-being of American households that can see long-lasting increases in their cost of borrowing that come from this. And of course, if we actually did default on the debt, the consequences would be catastrophic.
Thank you. I have but about 30 seconds left. Let me say this. Pakistan is a case study on the effects of climate change. As you know, Pakistan has suffered greatly from the flood that took place beginning in June of 2022. I'm going to ask if you would to use your good offices to help Pakistan. It clearly is in dire need of some aid from the IMF and the World Bank as well. This global warming is something that we may deny, but Pakistan is still suffering. It emits about 1% of the global greenhouse gases. We emit more than 10%, yet Pakistan suffers. Please do what you can to help. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, but in the interest of comedy, because the gentleman yielded time for Mrs. Wagner's answer, I'll let the Secretary briefly respond to the Pakistan question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're supportive of the IMF's work in Pakistan, and there is a program that is helping them deal with the devastation from the floods and their pre-existing fiscal and monetary problems, and we're certainly supportive of the IMF's work there.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Madam Secretary, in a March 12th interview on Face of the Nation, you said, quote, "The American banking system is really safe and well capitalized. It's resilient." In an April 14th interview on CNN, you said, quote, "Our banking system is well capitalized and liquid." In a May 12th Bloomberg TV interview, you said, quote, "What I see is a banking system that overall is well capitalized." Do you still believe that the banking system is well capitalized?
Overall, yes.
The prudential regulators, as you know, are preparing sweeping changes to the bank capital framework, which reportedly could raise required capital by 20% or more in what you concede is an already well-capitalized system. Do you support such a large required capital increase, which would have effects immediately on the U.S. economy, sidelining capital?
I have not seen the details of the proposals that the Fed is considering. We did agree with Basel III and commit to enact those proposals, and I will have to have a closer look at the Fed proposal.
I think you've answered my question already in these interviews. The banking system is already well capitalized. Whatever instability there may exist in the banking system, I would ask Treasury to consider your already well-informed view that the banking system is already well capitalized as you review the Fed's work. Let me follow up Mr. Luchtenmeyer and Mr. Scott's line of questioning on China. In addition to this committee, I also serve on the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. In that capacity, I am concerned about Western capital flows and U.S. investment in Chinese entities that threaten our national security. U.S. holdings of Chinese equity and debt securities have surged to over $1.2 trillion, which means scores of millions of Americans could have a vested financial interest in opposing any future sanctions or other penalties against China. I appreciate your testimony that the Biden administration is working to finalize an executive order to restrict outbound investments in China that threaten our national security. But this is an area where I believe where I believe Congress needs to act. And to that end, I've introduced the Chinese Military and Surveillance Companies Sanctions Act, which would direct OFAC to impose full blocking SDN sanctions on Treasury-designated Chinese military industrial complex companies, the Commerce Entity List, the Commerce Military End User List, and the DoD Chinese Military Companies List. Would you commit to pausing any outbound investment executive order pending the Congress putting forward that legislation so that Treasury can coordinate with congressional action?
You know, that's something that's up to the president, and I can't make a commitment about it.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And just for the administration's awareness, this committee and the Select Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee are working collaboratively in a bipartisan way on a outbound investment screening legislative package. And we would ask the administration to work with the Congress in coordinating whatever executive order that you're working on with this legislative proposal.
I know that we have had conversations with Congress, and we can pursue conversations and
look forward to working with you and Mr. Adeyemo on this. China and the Taiwan Strait scenario. In our select committee work, we did a tabletop exercise, and in response to sanctions against a Chinese scenario where there would be an invasion of Taiwan, the scenario was that China, the second largest foreign creditor of U.S. Treasuries, would dump that $859 billion in Treasury securities. How are you working with our allies internationally and also the Federal Reserve to deal with a situation where China would dump that volume of Treasury securities overnight?
So we are not engaging in specific exercises to address such a risk, but the United States, the National Security Council, is certainly concerned on an ongoing basis.
Well, Madam Secretary, I would encourage Treasury to make preparations and be on the ready for that scenario and work with the Fed on that and our allies. Finally, a follow-up to Mr. Lucas's question on the European Commission's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. I'm glad that you share our concern about the extraterritorial scope of that, but can you discuss specific steps that Treasury is taking to prevent this rule from applying to U.S.-based firms?
We're certainly expressing our concerns to the European Union in explaining the concerns we have.
Well, my time has obviously expired. I'll be in Sweden with a bipartisan delegation this week, and we will raise it as well there to the European Union. With that, my time has expired, and the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. You know, we have way too many acronyms in Washington. It's just they've gone wild. We need to get a select committee to deal with them. Because every time I think GTOs, I think about my first car out of college, a green GTO with a green vinyl top. Mr. Williams probably can speak to that, being an auto dealer. Has nothing to do with the purpose of this hearing. I just wanted to say it because I missed my car. But I do want to talk about GTOs, however, and because I'm concerned for a variety of reasons. How, and maybe FinCEN has to answer these questions, but how were the covered areas selected for the implementation of the $300,000 threshold for cash payments? Was there something about the 14 areas from the District of Columbia to Miami-Dade, Broward, or Palm Beach, and Palm Beach? I mean, how did we come to those areas?
I'm sorry, you're talking
for the
about
geographic target areas.
For what? Target areas for what?
For FinCEN's
FinCEN?
Yes. We're talking about real estate purchases.
For real estate purchases, they've proposed a rule on real estate purchases that would enable us to have better insight into areas where there may be illicit finance. We think that's an area that is being used to channel illicit funds.
I agree, but I'm trying to find out why the areas that have been selected were selected. There are 14 areas where.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're talking about geographic targeting orders. Yeah. I don't know. There were, I think, 14 areas that were selected, and I need to get back to you with the logic of why those areas were selected.
Well, and I'm maybe even more concerned about the areas that were not selected, because it seems to me that if we, if we're dealing with these 14 areas, if I were a bad actor, I just simply move to another I target another area.
So they have proposed a broader real estate rule that would go beyond those
Universal.
geographic. Yes.
Thank you very much. The other question about that is in 2021, FinCEN put forward an advance notice of a proposed rule to consider how best to focus its regulatory attention on residential and commercial real estate transactions. If you have that information, I'm interested in the timeline for the rulemaking and whether Treasury is going to address both residential and commercial real estate sectors in the same rule.
FinCEN is very actively working on those rules, trying to get them out to make the database available. And I can't give you exact timing on it, but it is a very high priority item for FinCEN.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you for being here today.
Gentleman yields his time. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. Over the past few years, businesses across the country have struggled to maintain necessary inventory due to global supply chain constraints. As a small business owner and auto dealer, I have dealt with these supply chain challenges firsthand. And making matters worse, businesses using the last in, first out, or better known as the LIFO inventory method, are facing significant recapture tax liabilities due to their inability, it's the factory's inability, to replace inventory levels by the end of the year, which is out of our controls. We as small business owners can't control that given the current supply chain disruptions. So Treasury has the ability to alleviate this financial burden on small business and provide relief through Section 473 of the Internal Tax Code. And this recapture tax, as we call it, relief would allow business owners to spend funds on replacing duplicated inventories. They wouldn't have to be laying people off. They could invest in their employees and maintain business operations instead of succumbing to unexpected tax burdens from uncontrollable inventory shortfall that's totally beyond the ability for the small business owner to control. So while I have been working with my colleagues to pass the Supply Chain Disruption Relief Act, which is the legislative fix to provide the LIFO tax relief, Secretary Yellen, could you explain if the Department of Treasury is really interested in helping Main Street and helping people who have been laid off, that have lost their job, can't pay their bills because of this? Are you ready to help provide the LIFO tax relief that you can do through gaining Section 473, which is going to be relief for businesses struggling to global supply chain disruptions that the small businesser cannot control? So it would be great if you could jump in, which we think you have the ability to do, and fix that right now.
So I'm aware of this issue, but I'm not able to give you a definitive response on this, and I will ask our Office of Tax Analysis to...
Well, ask them to do that because it's bipartisan. There's people in here that we've all agreed this needs to be done. This is not a partisan issue. It literally is going to save Main Street. It's going to save small business, and they'll pay tax when they need it and not pay tax when they don't need to. So I would appreciate if you would check into that and maybe get back with us on that.
Okay, we'll try to do that.
Thank you. I'm also concerned with FinCEN's proposed beneficial ownership rule that expands the information required under the Corporate Transparency Act and the effect that these expanded requirements will have on Main Street. The CTA was intended to ensure easy compliance for businesses. However, this proposed rule goes beyond the simple statute and lacks clarity on compliance guidelines. This will impact 32 million small businesses that will be expected to comply come 2024. And Acting Director Das has done little to inform the businesses on the new responsibility of reporting. So when talking to business owners back in my district and frankly all over the country, they've expressed their frustration with the insufficient information coming out of Treasury on how to comply and file returns properly, and they fear they'll be held liable for the non-compliance of the BOI rules. So Madam Secretary, what actions is Treasury taking to educate small businesses like mine in Texas
on their upcoming obligations to file beneficial ownership information with FinCEN? And when can we expect FinCEN to lay out a clear plan for engagement? We want to know the rules.
So FinCEN is working to finalize the rules that are necessary to make this very important, transformative database available, and understand that there are some burdens on small businesses to comply with this, and we'll work with them to provide information that's necessary for them to
Well, that's important. Small business wants to
comply.
comply. It's just like LIFO. We need to know the rules. Let's get it fixed so we can move on. And in the short time that I have, I'll cut my question a little back, but fentanyl is coming across our borders at an alarming rate, flooding our communities and killing thousands of Americans each year and future generations. We know law enforcement has found cartel members working directly with the Chinese money laundering organizations to outsource cartel operations and facilitate movement through the United States. So quickly, Madam Secretary, can you expand on what Treasury is doing to combat China and the role they play in cartel financing? Is the administration considering tougher sanctions? It's killing future generations of our young people.
We have put in place some sanctions, and we're looking to try to discourage and sanction the provision of precursor chemicals that are critical to the manufacture and sale of fentanyl. To the degree it's a critical
Gentleman's time has
issue
expired.
for us.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being with us this morning. Very quickly, I just want to say you mentioned the new World Bank President, A.J. Banga, in your testimony. I'm delighted that you've done so, and the World Bank obviously has had a turbulent recent past, and I think that Mr. Banga offers an opportunity for a real reset, and I hope that you'll really double down on the government's interaction and encouragement to the World Bank to be what it should be through Mr. Banga. What I want to talk with you about, though, is China. It's evident in this hearing, and generally evident, that the Congress has whipped itself into a frenzy with respect to China. I think this goes back to the Trump administration, when China was the all-purpose scapegoat along with immigrants for all of the nation's problems. And there are proposals, therefore, to cut China off from global capital markets, basically to devastate their economy. And I understand the emotion. We obviously are appalled by the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. We are appalled by their stealing of our intellectual property. The list goes on and on. But this is a moment, I think, that calls for a close statesmanship with respect to China. We are trading more with China than ever before. We are invested in China more than ever before. They own $1 trillion of our sovereign debt. I was pleased to see you, and I'm going to give you the remainder of my time to elaborate on this, say in the context of the G7, and I'm quoting you here, my own view is that that is to say U.S. economic efforts with respect to China, should be national security focused, not focused at undermining, say, China's economic competitiveness or ability to advance economically. Madam Secretary, is it in the national or economic security interest of the United States to impoverish the Chinese people?
No, I certainly do not think it is in our interest to stifle the economic progress of the Chinese people. China succeeded in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and I think that's something that we should applaud. We certainly do have legitimate concerns regarding China. First and foremost, national security, where we absolutely have to protect our national security interests and not compromise on that. Human rights is critically important, and strongly believe the president believes in sanctioning human rights abuses. And beyond that, we have legitimate concerns with China's behavior in some areas that are related to trade, where we think China's...
No, absolutely. Let me. This institution gets that, and I sit on the Intelligence Committee, so I have a closer than normal look at some of the just outrageous activities. But again, I'm just trying to find I'm trying to get at what you said, a policy that is statesman-like in its orientation. So let me, drawing on your experience as an economist and not, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
Let me focus on the positive then. I think we gain and China gain from trade and investment that is as open as possible, and it would be disastrous for us to attempt to decouple from China. De-risk, yes. Decouple, absolutely not.
What would be the effect on American consumers? Let's just imagine that we cut the hundreds of billions of dollars of trade that we have with China. If we cut that in half or eliminated that trade, what would be the effect on the American economy and American consumers?
Well, we benefit greatly from access to cheaper products, a wide array of products, and products in some cases where China has a technological lead, and in turn, China benefits from its purchases from us, and we benefit from our ability to export from China. Our competition with China, healthy competition, just as in a domestic case where firms compete with one another, leads to faster innovation, faster technological progress that benefits everybody concerned with better and cheaper products over time. And so this is very valuable interaction. And while we surely have concerns that need to be addressed, decoupling would be a big mistake.
Thank you. So I'm almost out of time, so I just want to add, I think that your concept of attacking the national security side of this without damaging the economic growth that comes from the two things is absolutely what we need to do. I hope you'll work with us.
Gentleman's time has
And I yield.
expired. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank Chairman McHenry for holding this important hearing today, and I want to thank you, Madam Secretary, for your testimony this morning. The National Bureau of Economic Research is the official recession scorekeeper, according to the White House. Pre-pandemic, or before the pandemic, the definition of a recession was pretty easy. It was 2 consecutive quarters of economic contraction. However, somewhere along the way in this new Biden administration, President Biden's tenure, the administration seems to have changed the definition of recession, and the National Bureau of Economic Research asserts that a recession is now, quote, a significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and lasts more than a few months, close quote. This has had a bit of a gaslighting effect on the American people, so I'd like to drill into it just a little bit. Secretary Yellen, does the National Bureau of Economic Research give any weight to real personal income when determining if we are in a significant economic decline?
They look at a wide array of statistics, and the second definition that you gave of a broad contraction that lasts more than several months, that is how the NBER...
Reclaiming my time, the answer is yes. Does the National Bureau of Economic Research directly consider inflation when determining if we are in a significant economic decline?
Inflation is not part of an economic decline.
Okay, well, the National Bureau of Economic Research, while it doesn't directly consider inflation, inflation is embedded into real income and spending variables that it tracks. So American families pay an average of $864 more per month today than they did when this administration started. That's an extra $126 on food per month, an extra $159 on shelter per month, an extra $123 on energy per month, just to name a few. This is since the Biden administration took office. Unless Americans have gotten a 15.3% pay raise in the last 2 years, they've effectively gotten a pay cut. Madam Secretary, has the average American income increased 15.3% during the Biden administration?
We have the strongest job market and
the answer
largest...
is, reclaiming my time, thank you, Madam Secretary. The answer is easy. It's no. Since President Biden took office, the average real personal income has only increased 2.4%. That would have been the answer. So while it costs nearly $900 more a month for American families to afford the same quality of life that they had in 2019,
Americans aren't getting paid anywhere near that much more. So how is it then that the National Bureau of Economic Research thinks it's appropriate to exclude inflation as a primary factor when determining the state of our economy? It's a rhetorical question, Madam Secretary, because we all know that the bureaucracy cherry picks the factors that yield the most convincing numbers for whatever narrative they want to assert, much like you were starting to deflect and say, we've got the greatest whatever. Americans know better. This administration is telling Americans the economy is strong, but Americans certainly feel like things are worse today than they were before President Biden took office. Secretary Yellen, I'm asking these questions because throughout 2021, you, along with several members responsible for fiscal decision-making in this administration, had incredibly asserted that inflation was, quote, transitory, perpetuating a fallacy the government could keep spending money it didn't have and everything and everyone would be just fine. Well, it's not fine. As a result of misrepresenting real economic conditions, trillions of dollars were printed, injecting cash into a shutdown system, which skyrocketed prices when we opened back up. Now, in order to tame runaway inflation, the Fed's only tool is to rapidly raise interest rates. The Fed is on its 10th consecutive rate hike, which are intended to purposefully increase unemployment, make it harder for Americans to find jobs, make it harder for Americans to buy a home or a car. These decisions, which unfortunately seem to be the only solution at this point, have harmed low-income Americans and Americans living on a fixed income the most. We should have never delayed implementation of monetary policy this long under the fallacy that inflation is transitory. The administration made a lot of decisions that crushed Americans, and clearly the fiscal decision makers of this administration are only concerned with cherry-picking favorable data for political purposes. It's time this administrative state becomes serious and gives us an accurate depiction of the economy and Americans suffering on the hands of an unaccountable government rather than gaslight their way out. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Madam Secretary. When resolving failed banks, there can sometimes be a tension between lowest cost resolution and the bipartisan desire to discourage further bank consolidation into a smaller number of very large banks. So my question is this an area where further guidance from Congress might be useful, for example, by providing some, well-defined wiggle room on least cost resolution? Or are there more effective levers that we might operate to discourage further bank consolidation?
Well, I mean, in general, the largest banks are not allowed to seek mergers to get bigger. And there is broad-based recognition that having a diversity of banking organizations, community banks, regional banks.
And this problem occurs at all levels of bank size as well, not just the G-size.
Very often it's possible in failing bank situations to resolve an institution without merging it into the largest banks. I know during the financial
I'm just wondering
crisis,
if there's some useful way to sort of tilt the playing field on that. Something analogous to the Buy American preferences, but not mandates that we put into federal contracts.
It's something that we could look at. I certainly.
So if you have
share
time
the
for a
goal
sort of thoughtful response for the record on this, I'd appreciate it.
Will do.
Okay, in regards to the debt limit, there's been some uncertainty expressed as to how the exact language of the debt limit law applies to the different forms of debt that have historically been issued by the Treasury. In particular, since the limit appears to only apply to the face value of certain types of bonds, it's been suggested that the debt issuance limit might not apply to, for example, interest-only consols, or the interest stream of premium bonds, or the separate auctions of the so-called strips of interest payments that are currently traded in the secondary market. In the run-up to this last crisis, our office made inquiries of Treasury on this, and I understand you were busy. We didn't get a response. But would it be possible to get a definitive response to this question? Because if this represents a safety net against defaulting on our payments, we want to know whether it's real.
Well, I'll try to give you a response on that.
Yeah, thank you. Now, on Ukraine, you mentioned the importance of anti-corruption reforms. And these will obviously become much more important when the international community starts dispensing hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to reconstruct of reconstruction assistance to Ukraine. And as you know, one of the big issues with central bank digital currencies is their potential traceability of transactions by the issuing entity. But it seems to me there's a potential role for that traceability in Ukraine assistance, in providing the Ukraine reconstruction assistance in traceable digital euros or digital dollars or some kind of reconstruction accounts that would remain traceable to identify corruption for a period of time until the Ukraine reconstruction is completed and the corruption has faded as a concern.
It's an interesting suggestion. I mean, Ukraine doesn't have a central bank digital currency. It's a major enterprise to introduce such a thing. You know, in the case of the United States, we're looking at it, but it's something that can take years. We are very focused on corruption and traceability and accountability for funds that are transferred to Ukraine right now. U.S. aid is being handled through the World Bank that has very rigorous standards for verifiability and accountability.
But it's still a struggle. I mean, you look at all the money we attempted to inject into Afghanistan, and it just disappeared in corruption.
Well, I honestly don't believe anything like that is happening, and we've hired, the USAID has hired a U.S. accounting firm to do independent checks and to review World Bank records. The IMF program for Ukraine focuses heavily on corruption and putting in safeguards and structural reforms to make sure that corruption is
Yeah, I understand. It just seems like there may be an acceptable bargain here that, yes, we will provide a tremendous amount of assistance for those who are willing to go back to Ukraine and rebuild the country, but the price for that will be a heightened level of visibility to the international community that's providing the funds.
I believe that's absolutely right, that certainly we demand accountability and
gentleman's
good
time has
governance
expired.
on Ukraine's part.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is recognized.
I thank the chairman. Secretary, thanks for your testimony today. Last month, it was announced that the Treasury Department hired 2 economists to study the effects and unintended consequences of sanctions. I think this is welcoming development given the expanded use of sanctions since the law passed, governing law passed in 1975 to create OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. How do you anticipate these economists will evaluate collateral damage that comes from sanctions? Do you see any implications for the status of the dollar as a world reserve currency, the payment system around the world, kind of the rivals that are confronting, macroeconomics today?
Well, we wanted to make sure that we do have experts who are consistently focused on analyzing the potential economic impacts of sanctions, since when we impose them, we always want to understand what the economic ramifications of them will be.
Do you think there's a real threat to the payment system that, we dominate today?
So the fact that the dollar is used as a reserve currency and plays such a huge role in international transactions does enable our sanctions to be much more effective. And it's not surprising that countries that are fearing they can be affected by our sanctions are looking for alternatives to the dollar. It's something that we simply have to expect. But the dollar plays the role it does in the world financial system for very good reasons that no other country is able to replicate, including China. And that is, we have deep and liquid, open financial markets, strong rule of law, and an absence of capital controls that no country is able to replicate. It will not be easy for any country to devise a way to get around the dollar.
Thank you. As the founder of the Sound Money Caucus, I certainly appreciate efforts to preserve the role of the dollar as the reserve currency. And frankly, I am concerned about the role of money being corrupted as a tool for coercion and control rather than a means of exchange and a store of value. And frankly, that seems at the heart of central bank digital currencies, but it kind of transcends down to one of the big developments globally where the United States dominates capital markets in terms of invested capital. In the space of fintech and cryptocurrencies, 75 to 90% of the liquidity is offshore. And it seems like there's an effort to not trust American citizens in this, which is if you can't really stop it altogether, you at least want to keep it account-based because you can control third parties. You can use them as intermediaries. That seems to be a feature to some of the people's thinking. Are you familiar with, in December 2022, FinCEN issued a request for comment on a potential rule that would ban self-custody, which is essentially the ability for individuals to own their own assets and have a permissionless payment system.
So I'm not familiar with the details of that rule, but certainly we are concerned about the use of cryptocurrencies and digital assets for illicit.
I think we're all concerned about illicit activity, but the question is, are you trying to stop individuals from having self-custody? Because there seemed like that was an effort that was underway under the end of the Mnuchin time as secretary. So is that something apparently hasn't risen to your level of concern?
I haven't had discussions of that.
Thank you. And I just say, as chairman of Housing and Insurance, I'm concerned a little bit about, do you consider a CDFI fund as a regulatory agency? What's the role here for CDFI fund?
It's not a regulatory agency, but I know it is in the process of reconsidering certifications for CDFIs, but it is not a regulatory agency.
Thanks for that point of clarification. And look, as we look at the conservatorship of the GSEs, one of the reports that is long overdue, was due in September of 2021, is the department's plan to get them out of conservatorship. I'll submit that for the record, but would you commit to responding to that in writing?
We want to work with Congress to do that. I think that Congress.
The gentleman's time has
right.
expired, and the secretary can answer for the record. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Let me start with this opening remark, since several of my colleagues on the other side have criticized you for your handling of the debt ceiling issue and your calculations of the X date. They've also placed the blame on the Biden administration for not solving this problem. So let me be very clear. My colleagues, in my opinion, across the aisle, and no one else, dragged us to the brink of default by using the debt ceiling as a weapon and a political tool to further their political agenda. Even the prospect of defaulting is harmful to the United States economy. We heard other witnesses, experts tell us defaulting would be harmful. And so what they did in jeopardizing our role on the political stage and creating opportunities for China and other foreign adversaries to weaken our power and influence. So I want you to know, Madam Secretary, thank you for consistently providing apolitical advice to Congress, because you did it, as you said, for what was best for the United States of America. So I wanted to be on the record saying that. Now, let me turn to, as I'm sure you're aware of, the number of countries paying a surcharge to the IMF has increased from 9 to 16 since 2020. That figure is estimated to increase to 38 countries in the coming years. I have a bill that I am co-sponsoring that would require an immediate review of surcharge policies at the IMF, with the requirement that the surcharge payments be suspended during the review process. Do you have any thoughts on this? Is it worth taking a closer look at this consequential policy, whether it's effective or whether there are unintended harmful consequences?
So I really have to say that we're supportive of the IMF's surcharge policy. It is part of their risk mitigation framework. And what surcharges do is provide incentives for borrowers with large outstanding balances to repay their loans promptly. And that's in keeping with the nature of IMF lending. For the poorest countries, there aren't surcharges that apply through the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust window. And these surcharges allow the IMF to build precautionary balances, which protect all the IMF members in case there's non-repayment. So I'm not in favor of try to work with you and understand the concerns, but I'm not in favor of changing the IMF's surcharge policy.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate that. Now, I'm gonna take a 190-degree shift, but I think it's in relationship to the state of international financial system, since I believe our money is international in many ways. And a couple weeks ago, we had some international dignitaries here from Canada. And one of the things that they were most proud of, they had a female on their $20 bill. And so you know where I'm going with this. In our last year's hearing, you indicated that you do everything within your power in a very bipartisan way. Over the last 3 congressional sessions, we've had people in your position look at what we were going to do with the 20. It came up that it was going to be Harriet Tubman. We were all in agreement with that. And so I have reintroduced my bill, Woman on the 20 Act of 2023. So here's what I'm asking. I understand all of the security and how we have to design the money, but could we not have a bill that simply puts in place the likeness of Harriet Tubman, just that part? Then you put it into the process that gets us to 2027 when I will not be here, and that we could get this moving. Comments?
So I want to see Harriet Tubman very much on the $20 bill. And I've promised, and I'm doing everything I possibly can to expedite that process. It essentially froze. We lost 4 years during the previous administration. When Secretary Liu proposed this in 2014, the scheduled date was 2030. I know that's a long time, but that's what it was, and we've gotten it back on that.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
But it is not.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized.
I want to thank Chairman McHenry and Ranking Member Waters for holding the hearing, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for being with us today. Secretary Yellen, on November 4th, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund released a new proposed CDFI certification application using the Paperwork Reduction Act. Why did the CDFI fund use the Paperwork Reduction Act instead of the Administrative Procedures Act for that change?
I'm not sure. I assume because the Paperwork Reduction Act requires examination of forms.
But I would note that the Paperwork Reduction Act was enacted to minimize the paperwork burden for stakeholders. The CDFI fund won't meet with interested parties while the proposal is pending because of a blackout period. And as I'm sure you are aware, there's significant concern that the change will make it very difficult and, in fact, potentially exclude many current CDFIs from participation in that program. Secretary Yellen, what is the statutory justification for this blackout period?
I can't tell you about the blackout period, but I know that what the CDFI fund is doing is attempting to update a certification process that hasn't been really reviewed in more than 25 years.
And I would submit that may be appropriate, but the Administrative Procedures Act, I think, would be the more appropriate pathway for that, and certainly would allow the kind of comment that I think the current proposed change really is screaming out for. Secretary Yellen, Jody Harris has recently stepped down as director from the CDFI fund. Given the mismanagement of the fund, someone with more expertise on the regulatory environment and safety and soundness expectations inside the CDFI fund would be incredibly helpful. Could you speak to Treasury's perspective on appointing a director with meaningful experience with insured depositories and consumer finance, and what other considerations you think are important to finding the right person to head up the fund going forward?
Well, we will certainly do a thorough search. The director of the CDFI fund is a career SES position, and in filling that job, we're governed by the Civil Service Reform Act, so it has to be based on merit, and there needs to be a competition with multiple candidates considered.
Thank you.
So, you know.
Well, thank you. I just hope you understand the turmoil that this has created among CDFIs across the country and the attendant impact that that's having on communities that are supposed to be being served by these important institutions. I want to shift gears. On Tuesday, March 21st, you suggested that deposits would be covered by federal insurance, quote, if smaller institutions suffer deposit runs that pose the risk of contagion, close quote. Before the Senate the next day, you said you had not considered, quote, blanket insurance or guarantees of deposits, close quote. But a day later, before the House, you said the Treasury, quote, would be prepared to take additional actions if warranted, close quote. Secretary Yellen, can you clarify Treasury's position on any sort of expansion of deposit insurance?
I'm sorry, I never intended to suggest that we were proposing expanding deposit insurance. Over time, that might be something the FDIC has issued a report, and it might be an appropriate topic to look at. But what I said was that I was prepared to work with other regulators, the FDIC and the Fed, to take actions similar to those we took in the case of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank to protect depositors when there was a risk of systemic contagion of bank runs, and that those tools would be available. And it could be the case that with a community bank that a run on a community bank, if it were judged that it could trigger broader systemic runs on other sound banks, it could also be appropriate to use those same tools.
Well, I will just say, as a board member of a community bank, I hope you keep in mind how important our community banks are to our rural communities and small communities across the country. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary. This year we have seen turmoil in the banking system, as you were talking about, and I'm concerned that our regulatory response hasn't focused enough on our small, medium, and regional banks that provide important competition in our banking system and obviously lifelines to American families and small businesses in our communities. Madam Secretary, do you believe that our response to recent failures and our broader regulatory approach ensures the health of small, medium-sized banks so we don't end up having a situation where we only have a few large banks that are simply too big to fail?
I believe strongly that a diversified set of financial institutions is best for America and provides a differentiated set of financial services that are appropriate for different borrowers.
Thank you. I'm particularly concerned that the current regulatory environment disadvantages some of the small and medium regional banks. Specifically, most recently with First Republic's receivership, I'm concerned that the largest banks were given preference in the bidding process, just enabling the biggest banks to grow even bigger. My understanding is that the FDIC kept certain regional banks from even bidding on First Republic. Madam Secretary, do you believe that well-situated small, medium, and regional banks should have the same opportunity to bid on failing banks as their larger peers do?
I believe that there should be a process with multiple bidders. It's up to the FDIC to run that process. And I know that there were multiple bidders in the case of First Republic.
But my understanding is that the regional and medium-sized banks were left out and not many weren't allowed to bid who were interested. Do you know about that?
I'm not sure that that's the case. I believe that there were multiple bidders, and they were not all large banks. So
No one was excluded if they wanted to, in your understanding, if they actually were interested in bidding, that they weren't told, sorry, you can't bid.
I can't give you every detail of what the FDIC did in this case, but I do know that there were multiple bidders, and that included some smaller banks, certainly some regional banks. The FDIC is required to accept the lowest cost bid, and it did that.
Okay,
It was
thanks.
JP Morgan
Yeah, no, I've just
Chase.
heard a lot of stories that banks were literally told, sorry, you can't even apply. You can't even try to bid for this. So, but I'll come back to you if I learn more about that. Switching gears, shifting focus to digital assets. Following the collapse of FTX last year, financial regulators have obviously ramped up scrutiny of digital asset firms. In a recent interview, you said that you, quote, see some holes in the system where additional regulation would be appropriate, end quote. Do you mind elaborating a little bit on that statement? Where do you see the holes? Where do you think additional clarity is needed for digital assets, please?
Well, one hole pertains to the supervision of spot markets where digital assets are not regarded as securities. So there needs to be regulatory authority there. And then I would say that stable coins is a type of digital asset that really requires a full-blown federal regulatory framework, and would very much, I think this is an area where congressional legislation is appropriate to create an appropriate prudential framework.
Thank you so much. When you spoke before this committee last Congress, you agreed with me that the state and local tax deduction cap has led to disparate treatment of American taxpayers. I'm concerned that the cap is pushing Americans out of states like mine and New Jersey as they seek lower tax states that are subsidized more heavily by the federal government. The House Ways and Means Committee is currently marking up tax legislation that noticeably does not address the burdensome SALT cap. It leaves it out completely, which I think is outrageous. In your view, does the SALT cap favor states that are heavily subsidized by the federal government and disrupt America's decisions on where they choose to live? Have you seen that at all in your work and how you study where finances are moving around the country?
I mean, it certainly does have a disparate impact on different states. The Biden administration has generally taken the view that it's up to Congress to decide what to do about that.
So you think it's probably a good idea for us to be addressing the SALT cap?
Well, that is the view that we had taken in recently.
Last quick question I'd like to get in on the national debt. Obviously, higher interest rates make our debt grow faster. What options is the department considering to address the fact that our country will be spending more money to service the national debt in the high interest rate environment? So
President Biden proposed a full-blown budget that contains substantial deficit reduction, $3 trillion over 10 years. At the same time, it invests in America, and
time has expired.
Revenue raisers
Thank you,
are part of
Secretary.
that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Yellen, thanks for being here today. As we approach the debt ceiling, the Treasury delayed issuing new U.S. Treasuries. Now that the debt ceiling has been increased, there's significant discussion that the Treasury may issue hundreds of billions, maybe $1 trillion of new Treasuries, in particular in short order. Do you hold the concern that others do that this may alter the interest rates the United States would receive on the issuance of those Treasuries? And if so, what mitigating measures are you and the Treasury taking to avoid additional costs on interest rates?
So it is our obligation to rebuild the Treasury balance up to a safe and appropriate level. But we've consulted widely with market participants about what the best way is to do that to minimize the cost to the federal government and to avoid market disruption to the maximum extent possible. And as we build our balance, we will certainly be careful to see if there are impacts or market disruption.
And what are those techniques and measures you're planning to implement to reduce volatility or increased interest rates?
Well, we will be issuing a substantial quantity of Treasury bills and cash management bills in the coming months, and we'll try to design those offerings to really be most attractive to market participants.
Thank you. I'm still really disappointed that the administration refused to negotiate with House Republicans for as long as they did, forcing the Treasury into this position rather than settling the debt ceiling debate much sooner, which we could have done if the president didn't move forward on his path of my way or the highway, refusing to negotiate with Republicans in the House. Let me shift gears if I can. I want to dive in on the Russia-Iran alliance that we're seeing taking place. Russia and Iran have established a defense partnership. Iran supplying weapons to Russia, reportedly potentially developing a drone facility inside Russia. And this has implications beyond Ukraine. It has significant implications across Europe and throughout the Middle East. Could you outline some of the steps Treasury has taken in response to this defense partnership? And do you believe that the measures have been effective?
Well, we are certainly attempting to make sure that our sanctions on Russia when it comes to acquiring military equipment are not evaded, and we are looking very carefully at ways in which evasion is taking place and attempting to address it jointly with our partners.
But should anything be done specifically regarding the Iran piece of this puzzle that has not been done to date? Or do you feel that the sanctions in place on Iran and working with our partners are currently sufficient?
We're constantly looking and reevaluating our sanctions, especially when we see evasion we have the strongest regime of sanctions against Iran is against virtually any country, and we're constantly looking to strengthen them. It's not something that's forever fixed, where when we see evasion, we are looking to strengthen them.
Understood, a very dynamic environment, not a static environment. Appreciate your attention to the matter.
Yes.
Let me shift gears pretty significantly here. We've seen the European Union aggressively push regulatory standards beyond their boundaries, impacting U.S. capital markets and U.S. based companies. I'm concerned if we fail to push back, American businesses will find themselves subject to European regulation. Are there EU regulations that this administration is planning to adopt or mirror? And have you determined separately that these regulations coming from the EU are in the best interest of the United States?
We're looking very carefully at the EU's Corporate Sustainability Directive, and we are concerned about the impact that it could have on U.S. firms. We're consulting with the EU and making clear that we are concerned about the directive's extraterritorial scope.
Yeah, I think we should be incredibly concerned. The U.S. has about 4% of the world's population, but about 50% of the capital markets reside in the United States. I'm concerned that the European approach to regulation actually negatively impacts their ability to be a leader in the capital markets. Recognizing my time, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you, Secretary, for being here with us today. We really appreciate having this conversation. I'm going to continue on an issue that's been a concern for this committee on both sides of the aisle. As you know, adversaries like Russia and China, Iran, North Korea, and others have been working to replace and circumvent and undermine the U.S. dollar for decades now. But now we're also seeing calls to reduce the dependence on the U.S. dollar from corners of the globe, including allies of ours like France and maybe India and others more recently. From your perspective, what is the biggest risk to the U.S. dollar? Is it global geopolitics, or is it concerns here in the U.S. Capitol of not being able, of U.S. Politics, not being able to pass a debt limit, for example, this past week?
Well, I have previously and will again express my concerns about the debt limit. The dollar is used widely as a reserve asset because of the depth and liquidity of U.S. capital markets, the safety of Treasury securities, and the longstanding practice of the United States to honor its obligations. And it's that commitment that we can be trusted to pay our bills that is the foundation for our high credit rating and for the dollar's role as a reserve currency. So when we have episodes like the debt ceiling episode, that concerns me. Of course, our sanctions are in part enabled by the important role of the dollar and U.S. banks in the financial system. We work whenever possible with other countries.
But if I may, should we be more concerned now in slapping sanctions on countries around the world and taking that into consideration and be more thoughtful as we may be creating a paranoia around the world where people are looking for other currencies to do transactions?
It is true that when we impose sanctions, countries that are afraid they can be the subject of those sanctions are motivated to look for other tools other than the dollar to engage in transactions. So
but even
that's
our
something
friends,
we have to accept. It is much more difficult to find other tools to make payments, other currencies, when we work jointly with
but we even have our
partners.
friends like France also looking for other currencies and pushing it.
You know, France and some of our allies were not happy when we pulled out of JCPOA and imposed sanctions. And I would say there is virtually no meaningful workaround for most countries for using the dollar as a reserve currency.
Very well, and I understand earlier you made some statements about it's being the most stable option with the rule of law and liquidity and all
Yes.
that. But isn't it the fact that the use of the dollar has diminished and gone down against competing currencies over the years?
There's been some increase in holdings of other reserve assets, but that's something to be expected in a growing world economy where there is a desire to diversify, but
so we should expect less use of the
reliance-
dollar, is what you're saying. We should anticipate.
We should expect over time gradually increased share of other assets in reserve holdings of countries. It's a natural desire to diversify, but the dollar is far and away the dominant reserve
It's
asset.
still a huge concern for us here in Congress. And just changing gears briefly, under the new minimum tax system, lawmakers permit companies to reduce their taxable income by the amount of their depreciable deductions. Companies in most capital-intensive industries with high value of tangible property can claim these depreciation deductions and use tax deferral to invest in their business. This provision was included in the Inflation Reduction Act to protect companies from the potential impact of book minimum tax by not capitalizing investment. However, these deductions are not accessible to oil and gas producers because of their capital expenditures are classified as intangible drilling costs within the different section of the tax code. Due to this designation, oil and gas producers are unfairly targeted. I hope you can...
Gentleman's time has expired.
We're hugely concerned, and we'd love for you to be able to address this to our office.
And the secretary is welcome to submit for the record. Thank you. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, thank you for being here today. You and I have disagreed on the best approach to address a number of challenges facing this country. I'm going to briefly highlight two areas where your policy proposals ultimately were quite simply deemed bad for the American people, but then I'm going to end on an area where I think we're going to find agreement. First, you spent much of 2021 saying that inflation was transitory and likely to abate once COVID-specific factors subsided. These talking points were then parroted by various officials in the administration and Congress to justify trillions more in additional spending. All the while, Larry Summers, President Clinton's Treasury Secretary and Director of President Obama's National Economic Council, aggressively warned against such spending, warning it would further exacerbate inflation. Then a year ago, almost to the day, you were quoted saying that you failed to anticipate how long elevated inflation would continue to plague American consumers. Finally, on June 7th of this year, you said that you expected inflation to subside over the next 2 years. So simply put, you got it wrong in a number of places, and that error in judgment caused immense damage to the American people. It caused the cost of goods to soar, salaries to be reduced in relative value. It denied the American dream of home ownership, just overall hardship in general. And so I just want to point out, policies coming out of Washington have very serious consequences, and it seems policymakers often forget that. Second, I want to go, 18 months ago, we had a back and forth, somewhat heated, where I criticized your proposal to collect Americans' bank account balances. I said it was not a serious policy proposal and only designed as a way to let Democrats justify spending more money we don't have. The Senate wisely sidelined this proposal, and the American people are better off because of it. Again, policies coming out of Washington have consequences, and we must be thoughtful in our policy proposals and actions. They do have real consequences for the American people. Now, on to an area I think we're going to agree. And I was pleasantly surprised that my colleague across the aisle, Mr. Gonzalez, just brought it up. And I'm going to just pose a question to you. It's fairly simple. Do you agree that it is important for the dollar to remain the global reserve currency? Is that a priority of yours?
Yes, I think it is important for the dollar to be the world's reserve currency.
I agree with you. Thank you. I guess maybe could you just highlight why you feel that way? What are the factors that go into that policy decision of yours?
Well, as the safest and most sought-after asset, the dollar as a reserve currency means that our interest rates are the lowest of really any borrower around the globe, and it lowers our cost and
makes it easier to trade. It makes it easier to compete in the global economy. It builds our allies abroad. If you agree that it is important to push this policy forward and to maintain the dollar as a global reserve currency, I guess why has President Biden nominated Jared Bernstein to be the chairman of the Economic Council of Advisors? He is on record in numerous op-eds stating that we should actively take steps to remove the dollar as a global reserve currency. It's a burden and not a privilege, and we should end the dollar as the global reserve currency. Why would President Biden, who I'm assuming you work very closely on these issues with, place someone in such a position of trust and authority that disagrees with his own Treasury Secretary?
I'm not going to speak to Jared Bernstein's views on this particular issue.
Well, your views are diametrically opposed, and he disagrees with you. And so I guess just please make sure that you continue to push to maintain the dollar as a global reserve currency. I guess let's go back to debt. Debt to GDP ratio in April was 119%. I have serious concerns about our spending, our unsustainable spending, and that it will further erode our ability to maintain the dollar as a global reserve currency. We saw that Greece, at 180% debt to GDP, went into austerity measures and had to get the EU to bail them out. Madam Secretary, nobody's going to bail us out. The American people are not able to. So what do you think about our unsustainable spending, and is our debt to GDP ratio a concern of yours as it relates to maintaining the dollar as the reserve currency?
It's critical that we remain on a fiscally sustainable course. And there are different...
Did you say remain? We are not on a fiscally sustainable course, Madam Secretary.
Well, the president presented a budget with $3 trillion of deficit reduction over the next decade. And what I regard as the most important metric
That's
of
shooting a
sustainability.
bullet at a
Gentleman's
freight
time
train.
has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Secretary Yellen, for joining us today. I represent the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, vibrant, diverse, dynamic, unequal. And I'm sure my colleagues have grown tired of my enumerating these damning statistics, but imagine how tired people are of actually living them. In a 3-mile radius from Cambridge to Roxbury, Median household income drops by $50,000. Federal Reserve of Boston put out a Color of Wealth report, which cites that the average wealth for a Black Boston family is $8, whereas for a white family, it is $250,000. So I'm going to use my time with you to discuss an issue that is paramount that we tackle. It's a national problem, and that is the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap in the United States is over $10 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Truly a shameful reality for the American economy. Secretary Yellen, do you agree that we have a colossal racial wealth gap in our country?
Of course, you cited statistics that show how significant that is, and President Biden is committed to doing all that he possibly can, and I'm committed as well to take meaningful steps.
Thank you. And of course, we know that this racial wealth gap didn't just appear out of nowhere. Black Americans in this country have been systematically stripped of our wealth. First, there was nearly 250 years of enslavement, followed by a century of Jim Crow, segregation, economic exploitation, state-sanctioned violence. And to this day, Black Americans are still being excluded from and facing barriers to public programs that promote home ownership and higher education, along with discriminatory home appraisals, persistent redlining. Only bold, transformative, precise economic policies can address the impact of compounded racism and exploitation. We are heading into Juneteenth. Grateful that that is now a federal holiday, but policy is my love language. I believe we need federal reparations to close the racial wealth gap once and for all. Secretary Yellen, under your leadership, you have established a Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. This truly represents a historic opportunity to center racial justice in our economic agenda. Can you speak to some top lines of the work of this committee?
We formed, as you said, T-Acre is an advisory committee to help us evaluate every area in which Treasury has responsibility, where we need to recognize if discrimination may take place, and we should be changing our policies to make Treasury itself more diverse and more responsive to be able to address structural racism. And
thank you, Secretary Yellen. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. So I did want to just bring to your attention, and I'm grateful for the work of the committee and look forward to learning more about that. But myself and Senator Cory Booker have introduced the American Opportunity Accounts Act. If passed into law, this would represent the most ambitious federal effort to directly address wealth inequality. At birth, every child would receive $1,000 in a savings account managed by the Treasury Department. Children from low-income families receive deposits every year, and once they reach the age of 18, they can use the funds they have saved for specific purchases such as buying a home, pursuing higher education. There's growing momentum around the country for our baby bonds legislation from Massachusetts, California, Connecticut, New York, Washington, D.C. Do you agree that the Treasury Department should further look into baby bonds as a tool to address wealth inequality in our country?
Well, certainly this is a key priority of the Biden administration, and not just a Treasury matter, but I think it's a very constructive suggestion. As you know, President Biden has proposed many policies that would be complementary, including extending the child tax credit and making sure that it's refundable, which did succeed in cutting poverty by 50%.
Absolutely. Thank you, Secretary Yellen. I do see baby bonds as the kind of investments that will break cycles of generational poverty and systemic economic oppression and put us one step towards closing the racial wealth gap. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for appearing here, Ms. Yellen. Ms. Yellen, your statement that the president is working on a path of cuts that will guess, get our economic house in order. You said $3 trillion over the next decade?
That's his budget.
That's his
as he
budget.
presented.
Is that not like saying you're going to drain the ocean a teardrop at a time? We're on tap where the interest on the debt will exceed our whole military budget. How does that square with his statement he wanted a clean debt ceiling?
Well, short-term interest rates have gone up substantially, but longer-term interest rates are lower, and most economists and Fed officials believe that over the medium term, real interest rates, which is what's important to our debt burden, will decline. I mean, not be.
Ma'am, this president is on tap to spend $4 trillion. And I find it astonishing that in your position you make that type of statement. Now, the debt limit X date it's changed. It moved from June 1 to June 5th and maybe in July. Did you get with, and we had a president who was missing in action for over 100 days, didn't want to negotiate. Was this a strategy to ramp up the press to just move the date?
I want to insist that there was nothing whatsoever about the advice that I gave to Congress that was political.
You didn't get with this administration.
I gave consistent.
Reclaiming my time, Ms. Yellen, I'm trying to ask you a question. Did you not get with this administration to move the dates to ramp up the pressure that the media was daily saying this country was going to let me finish, and I'll let you hopefully get some time in if you will not filibuster. But so you didn't get together with the president or the administration to just move dates, because that's very critical. If it was really July or later, why didn't you tell us?
Well, the answer is an unambiguous no, I did nothing of the sort. And the very first letter that I sent to Congress in early January indicated that early June was a time that we were concerned our balance might not be sufficient.
Based on what?
On our forecasts of spending and revenues, we could see that early June was a matter of concern. We waited until our tax revenues came in after the April 18th
That was fluid, Ms. Yellen. That was fluid. You had California, who I think 51 counties were exempt from getting the timeline, the tax revenues in. We wrote you 2 letters to explain what your metrics were that you used to determine that the country was going to run out of money and not pay the.
Well, I'm sorry, but on June 2nd, the day after Congress raised the debt ceiling, the Treasury balance declined to $23 billion, which may sound like a lot of money, but it's absolutely a
you never responded to
insufficient.
Ms. Yellen, you never responded to 2 letters to give us the metrics of how you gave those dates out. I'm running out of time. Let me cover one other subject. I'm reclaiming my time. Ms. Yellen, I'm reclaiming my time. You've mentioned several times about the sanctions that this administration is putting on Russia. Was enabling the Nord Stream pipeline a sanction to this administration put on Russia, or did it enable Russia to get the revenues that they are today?
The administration has long been opposed to Nord Stream 2.
They're the ones that opened it up. President Trump discontinued it. Are you saying this administration did away with the enabling the Nord Stream pipeline to be built?
I believe that the president made clear his opposition to the pipeline.
Then why did it get put in use under this administration? It's being built now.
Well, it's no longer. Germany is.
So nothing has changed from the Trump administration to the Biden administration on enabling the Nord Stream pipeline to be in existence, to remain in section, to be built. Ms. Yellen, I tell you what to do. If you could, I'm out of time. If you'd respond in writing, I sure would appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Secretary, would you like to answer the final question so that the record is clear on your position regarding the debt ceiling date?
Regarding the debt ceiling date.
Based on the questioning from the previous colleague.
Yes, my very first letter to Congress indicated that while we had confidence that we could pay the government's bills until early June, but that highlighted that we were concerned that we might not after early June. We waited. There's considerable uncertainty about what our resources will be months ahead. It was critical to see what incoming tax revenue was. Once we saw that, we realized that early June was an even more serious problem than we indicated. And in several letters, I highlighted that June 1st, that we felt our resources would expire in early June, possibly as early as June 1st.
Thank you.
Our final letter
I just wanted to give you an opportunity
June
to
5th,
clear the record.
which is awfully close to June 1st.
Thank you. And to be clear, it was all because of a self-inflicted manufactured debt limit crisis that my Republican colleagues caused, which had Democrats not delivered the votes in the House, would have caused a default, causing our economy to spiral out of control across the U.S., globally, and affect millions of jobs. Now, at the same time, we also have heard from my colleagues who've demanded more for fiscal austerity and a balanced budget. Now, as if without a second thought for their vigorous push for the government to tighten its belt, here we go again with another round of ill-advised cuts to vital revenue. House Republican tax cut scam will cost the United States taxpayers upwards of $1.1 trillion. I find that outrageous. Again, as they work towards deep cuts to essential programs like Social Security and Medicare, their extreme idea of fiscal restraint is another tax giveaway for big corporations across this country. Now, House Democrats and President Biden have fought hard to protect American workers and ensure we lead the clean energy transition into the 21st century, yet and still the House GOP are siding with their wealthy backers and the fossil fuel industry. The folks in my district in Nevada deserve more investment in our people, in our health, in our environment, and in our clean energy economy, and yet the recently introduced and misnamed Tax Cuts for Working Families Act accomplished none of these priorities. That's why it should be called the Republican Tax Scam 2.0. Secretary Yellen, do you have any indications as to the consequences of the proposed $1.1 trillion in lost tax revenue and how that would stem from these proposed cuts?
The ones that are now under consideration.
Correct.
Well, they would benefit wealthy individuals and corporations and do nothing for working families. And
is it paid for?
No, it's
and so that
no,
will
it's
add
not
to the
paid
debt,
for, and
correct?
Of course, it would exacerbate.
And
the
so
debt.
they will then have to pay interest on the debt
yes.
for tax cuts for the very wealthy while balancing the budget on the backs of working people that I represent.
Yes.
Additionally, could you discuss the macroeconomic cost associated with stripping away the recently passed tax incentives for clean energy production and clean energy vehicles with a specific focus on the harm to American domestic manufacturing in the green technology sector?
We have seen a renaissance in manufacturing in the United States as a consequence of the Inflation Reduction Act. There is tremendous investment that is taking place in our clean energy economy. It's creating good jobs all across the country, and not just on the coast, but in parts of the country that really have seen a decline in manufacturing jobs, and it would have a very harmful effect.
All I'll say in closing is the American people are watching. They're very smart. They know that the Republicans are not for fiscal austerity, not when they're giving tax cuts to the very wealthy
Gentleman's time
on the
has
backs of
expired.
working Americans.
The Secretary has graciously agreed to stay so that Representative Garcia and I may ask questions. We thank you very much for that, Secretary. And now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank you. I want to go back just and cover the CS3D relatively briefly, because you've been asked about that a few times, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive coming out of Europe, where U.S. businesses could be sued by the EU for simply doing business with so-called high-impact companies such as natural gas. And that's a real big concern of mine, as well as coal. Madam Secretary, coal, as you very well know, is essential for the production of steel. And every company is producing steel, particularly anthracite steel, which I have an abundance of in my district. So if the EU were to pass something like this, it could, and there are analysis on this, affect the stock prices and the valuations and the business of over 63% of the S&P 500, and really set a precedent that Europe can regulate the United States. And certainly the EU is in high demand for LNG. So I'm really asking you, as a governor of the IMF, are we pushing, or not just the IMF, but in general in your role, are we pushing back strongly on this? Are we doing an analysis? Are we really taking this very seriously to relate it to the CS3D?
I'm sorry, the CSDD?
The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive?
That's an EU initiative, and I've indicated that we have concerns about it, that it can impact our firms in ways that would have unintended consequences that concern us.
And you did indicate that, but doing just say $150 million in business in Europe, if a company does $1 billion here, that regulation would be mandated for that company as a whole.
That's why we have concerns. I agree.
Significant concerns, I would hope, Madam Secretary. So, are you doing a cost-benefit analysis of this? What its effect would be? Is that part of your due diligence?
Well, I don't think we have to do a cost-benefit analysis, but I think we do have to express our concerns to the EU and try to see that they're addressed.
Okay, I'm hoping we can be kept updated on this, Secretary, because again, this is a real serious issue that I'm not sure too many businesses are fully aware of, being regulated by the EU.
It's not yet final legislation, it's draft.
Right.
And it's hard to know exactly what its impact will be on EU firms, but we advocate for it to be addressed by the EU.
I do want to ask you this, more of a broad question. Does the Treasury, your department obviously, the Fed, the White House, do you have conversations where you look at the economy as a whole and say, look, with all the Fed stimulus, with this excessive spending, let's face it, that took place, a slowdown of American energy, which had a lot to do with the spiking of gasoline prices, which obviously attributes to inflation, a rise of interest rates, which is doing awful things that I want to talk about on the service to our debt. But do you have the conversation, say, let's take a holistic view here, and maybe we should have some pro-growth initiatives?
We certainly take a holistic view, have many discussions of the outlook and what's appropriate. And I will say that when President Biden was elected and the ARP was passed, the unemployment rate in the United States was exceptionally high. And there was a real risk that we would have a generation of Americans.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we had COVID, and that we deliberately shut down the government, and it's the same unemployment rate that we had in 2019, and yet there's still close to 2 million people not working. So it's not working. We've got all this inflation. We've got debt as far as the eye can see. And you know what's unbelievably alarming, Secretary, is that in 2021, when the Biden administration came in, our service on our debt was $275 billion. I'm sure I don't have to tell you these numbers. In 22, it was $385 billion. This year, it's going to be a staggering $660 billion. Next year, it's likely to be higher than our defense. So it's not working. It seems to me the growth strategy is to spend more. I mean, is that considered a growth strategy?
Well, a growth strategy does involve investing in America, and President Biden has put in place proposals and legislation that does aid our growth.
Thank you, Secretary. My time has expired. The gentlewoman from Texas now, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for joining us here again today. Secretary Yellen, under your leadership and in collaboration with President Biden, the Treasury Department has done excellent work promoting a strong and vibrant domestic economy and assisting countries in need internationally. I want to thank you for that. I want to quickly just follow up on a couple of the questions before I get to one of my own. You've consistently said that it's important that the dollar remain strong and be the currency of the world. I've been troubled by the number of businesses, small retailers, even at airports and coffee shops, that are beginning to not even take the dollar anymore. They don't take cash. There's a bigger reliance on credit cards. What does that do to our economy and to the stature of the dollar if in fact cash is king and the dollar is the emperor or the king? What does that do, and how are we doing with the interest rates on credit cards and the transaction fee charges?
Well, look,
that's a lot of questions in one.
Using credit cards, we're still using the dollar as a currency. It doesn't have to be physical currency. We want an efficient payment system, and electronic payments are becoming faster and cheaper, and we're still using the dollar even when we make payments using plastic. But credit card fees do remain very high, and it's important to foster innovations that will improve and reduce the costs associated with making payments. The Fed is bringing into operation a system called FedNow that will make 24/7 real-time payments a reality in the United States, and I hope that's a system that will promote cheaper and faster and safer payments.
Right, so where are we on the development of a digital dollar?
The White House is running a task force that includes the Federal Reserve and other agencies to look at whether or not it's in the United States' interest to develop a digital dollar, a central bank digital currency. It's a complex situation where there are both benefits and costs, and we continue that work, and hopefully we'll be able to consult with Congress and recommend a way forward.
Thank you. And I heard you say that there was $3 trillion, was it $3 trillion in cuts in the next decade in the president's budget? And that would be the cuts in the deficit?
Yes.
And the number of jobs that have been created under President Biden in just, what is it now, 28 months?
13
is about
million
13
jobs.
million. So while there may be some Americans who are unemployed, the reality is that there's been 13 million jobs created.
And we have almost the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years in this country. Now, inflation is too high and needs to be brought down, and that is a top priority, but the job market could hardly be stronger.
Right, and I hear reports that the supply chain issues, by and large, are getting resolved, that things are getting back on track except for a few items. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and inflation has come down 5% from its high. So while it is too high, it has still moved down considerably.
Well, I actually will submit another question or two for you in writing because I'm running out of time. But again, I just want to thank you for your leadership and your steadfast commitment and passion in ensuring that not only that the dollar is always king, but that cash is king. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. We would like to thank Secretary Yellen very much for your testimony and for your extended time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witness to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for her response. I ask you, Secretary Yellen, to please respond no later than July 14th. If you would please, 2023. For purposes of the second hearing, we will begin at 2 p.m. today or immediately following floor votes, whichever occurs earlier. This hearing is adjourned.